Vincent Romano grabbed Anthony Russo by the collar and slammed his face into the stainless steel counter so hard the entire kitchen went silent. The sound of bone cracking against metal echoed off every wall. Blood ran down Anthony's chin onto his white chef's coat. 22 years of loyal service. One broken dish, one broken nose. Vincent stepped back, chest heaving, and pointed at the door. "You're done." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And that was the night Vincent Romano's empire began to die. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart pounding, please subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The kitchen of Romani's Vincent Romano's flagship Italian restaurant on Michigan Avenue had survived 2 decades of pressure. It had survived inspections, health scares, staff walkouts, and the brutal winters that Chicago threw at everything it wanted to break. It had survived because of one man, and that man was not Vincent Romano. That man was Anthony Russo. Anthony had been with Vincent since the very beginning, back when Vincent was still a young man with big hands and bigger ambitions, running food orders between neighborhoods that most people didn't visit twice. Anthony had cooked in a hot truck beside him. He had learned Italian recipes from Vincent's own mother, Carmela, a woman who believed food was the language God used when he wanted to say something kind. Anthony had memorized every dish ever made. He had turned those recipes into a menu that wealthy people drove across the city to eat. He had built the reputation of Romani's from the ground up, one plate at a time, one late night at a time, one sacrifice at a time. And on the night everything fell apart, Anthony had been working for 16 hours straight. It had started at 6 in the morning when his sous chef called in sick and nobody could find a replacement fast enough. Vincent's management team sent 2 messages and then stopped trying. Anthony had absorbed it without complaint because that was who he was. He rearranged his team. He covered 3 stations himself. He pushed through the lunch rush that day, a private corporate event for 90 people, and then pushed through the afternoon prep for the dinner service, and then pushed through the dinner service itself, which was the biggest night of the month, because Vincent had invited one of his most important business contacts, a billionaire named Gerald Ashford, who had flown in from London specifically to eat at Romani's and to discuss a partnership that Vincent had been pursuing for 2 years. Everything had to be perfect, and for 16 hours, Anthony made sure it was. Then at 10:47 in the evening, with the kitchen finally winding down and the main courses already delivered, and Gerald Ashford apparently satisfied and drinking expensive wine at his table, Anthony carried out the signature dessert himself. A handcrafted semi-freddo with gold leaf and a raspberry reduction that had taken him 3 hours to prepare. The kind of dish that made food critics write paragraphs. The kind of dish that made men like Gerald Ashford feel like they were eating something worth crossing an ocean for. Anthony was walking toward the server's pass-through when his left foot caught the edge of a floor mat that had folded up at the corner. It was a maintenance issue that had been reported twice to the facilities team and ignored both times. Anthony felt his weight shift. He tried to correct. His arms went out to stabilize. The plate tilted, and then the semi-freddo 3 hours of work, gold leaf and all went sideways and hit the floor. The kitchen went quiet. Not completely quiet. The equipment still hummed. The ventilation still ran. But every human being in that room stopped moving and looked at Anthony, and then looked at the doorway because Vincent Romano had just walked through it. Vincent had been at the table with Gerald Ashford when one of his managers had leaned down and whispered to him. And now he was standing in the kitchen doorway in his $3,000 suit, looking at the broken dessert on the floor, and his face was doing something that everyone in that room recognized immediately. They had seen that face before. They knew what came next. Anthony. Vincent's voice was very quiet. That was the thing people always misunderstood about Vincent Romano. They thought his anger sounded like thunder. It didn't. It sounded like ice. It sounded like the moment before something very bad happened. Quiet, controlled, and somehow because of that control, more frightening than screaming would have been. Anthony straightened. He was 53 years old. He had a bad knee from a kitchen accident 12 years ago. He had missed his daughter's high school graduation because Vincent had needed him on a Friday night. He had missed his mother's funeral reception because there was a private event at Romani's the same day and nobody else could run the kitchen. He straightened and he looked at Vincent and he said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Romano. The mat by Station 4 has been—" "I don't want to hear about a mat. Sir, I've been here since 6 this morning and the floor crew. Anthony, Vincent stepped into the kitchen. Do you understand what's happening out there right now? Do you understand who is sitting at that table? I understand, Mr. Romano. I'll have another plate ready and there is no another plate ready. Vincent's voice dropped another degree. That was the last of the preparation. You know that, I know that, everyone in this room knows that. He took another step. So what you're telling me is that Gerald Ashford flew across an ocean, sat at my table, and is not going to get what I promised him. I can prepare something else. I can have something out in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Vincent repeated it like the words tasted wrong. 20 minutes. And what exactly am I supposed to tell him for 20 minutes that my chef dropped his dinner? Sir, please, it was an accident. The floor mat. Stop talking about the floor mat. The kitchen was completely still. Nobody moved. Nobody looked directly at either man. They all stared at surfaces, at countertops, at their own hands, at the walls. The way people look when they know something terrible is about to happen and they don't want to be seen watching. Vincent Romano reached out and grabbed Anthony Russo by the front of his chef's coat. What happened next lasted maybe 4 seconds. 4 seconds that 23 people witnessed. 4 seconds that nobody in that kitchen would ever forget. 4 seconds that would eventually cost Vincent Romano more than any business deal he had ever lost, more than any enemy he had ever faced, more than anything Gerald Ashford could have offered him. When it was over, Anthony was leaning against the counter with one hand pressed to his face, and blood was running through his fingers, and the sound the counter had made when his face hit, it was still hanging in the air like something that couldn't be unsaid. Vincent stepped back. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the room, at the line cooks frozen at their stations, at the pastry chef standing in the corner with her hands over her mouth, at the servers who had been passing through and were now rooted to the floor. And he said in that same quiet voice, "Clean this up. Someone get him out of my kitchen, and someone find me a plate that doesn't embarrass this restaurant." Then he walked back out to the dining room, back to Gerald Ashford, back to his wine and his business deal, in his world where men like Anthony Russo were simply problems to be solved and then forgotten. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Marco, one of the line cooks who had been with Romani's for 11 years, walked over to Anthony and put a hand on his shoulder. "Can you stand?" Anthony nodded. He was breathing carefully, the way people breathe when they're trying not to show how much pain they're in. "Let me see," Marco said quietly. Anthony lowered his hand. His nose was broken. That was visible from across the room. His eye was already beginning to swell. Marco looked at it and said nothing, but the expression on his face said everything. From the pastry chef's corner came a sound. Small, controlled. Elena, who had been at Romani's for 7 years, and who everyone in the kitchen quietly believed was the most talented person in the building, put down the piping bag she was holding and started to untie her apron. She did it slowly, methodically, the way someone does something when they've made a decision that they know is final. "Elena," Marco said. She didn't answer. She folded the apron and set it on her workstation. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her employee badge, and set that down too. Then she picked up her personal knife roll, every chef's most prized possession, the tools they owned themselves, and she walked to the back of the kitchen toward the staff lockers. For a moment, nobody else moved. Then Danny, a line cook who had started at Romani's at 19 years old and was now 27, pulled off his own apron. Then Carla, who ran the salad station and had 2 kids at home and desperately needed this job, put down her tongs. Then the servers in the doorway started backing away. It didn't happen fast. It didn't happen with speeches or declarations or anyone shouting about justice. It happened slowly, quietly, the way things collapse when the foundation finally gives out all at once. One person, then another, then another. People who had spent years swallowing their fear and doing their jobs because they needed the money, because they had families, because they believed the situation would eventually improve, or because they simply didn't see another choice. Those people looked at Anthony standing there bleeding and made the same calculation that human beings make when they finally reach the end of something. They decided that their dignity was worth more than their paycheck. By the time Vincent Romano came back to the kitchen 20 minutes later, after managing Gerald Ashford with the charm, he could turn on like a faucet when the situation required it. The kitchen of Romani's was nearly empty. 7 people remained, 7 out of 31. Vincent stood in the doorway and looked at the space where his staff had been. He said nothing for a long time. The 7 people who had stayed were watching him carefully, waiting. Some of them were afraid. Some of them were angry. Some of them, and this was the part that would stay with Vincent much longer than he expected. Some of them looked at him with something that was almost worse than anger. They looked at him with sadness, as if they had hoped he would be different, as if they had somewhere deep down still believed that this wouldn't happen, that it had been a long time since he had done something like this, that maybe he had changed, that maybe the years had softened him enough, and now that hope was gone and they were grieving it. Vincent didn't recognize that look. He had seen fear on people's faces so many times that it had become ordinary to him, almost invisible like furniture in a room. He stopped noticing years ago. He had seen anger and resentment and desperation. But this quiet grief, this particular kind of disappointment was new to him. And because it was new, he didn't know what to do with it. So he ignored it. "Where is everyone?" he said. One of the remaining servers, a young man named Patrick, who had only been at Romani's for 4 months and therefore still had the ability to be genuinely surprised, said, "They left Mr. Romano, most of them." Vincent looked at Patrick for a moment. Then he looked around the kitchen again. The half-finished dessert components on the counters, the aprons folded and left behind, the silence where 30 people used to move and talk and work. "Call the agency," he said finally. "I need replacements by tomorrow morning." "Which agency, sir?" "Any of them, all of them. I don't care. I need a full kitchen staff by morning." He walked back out. In his office on the upper floor, Vincent Romano sat down behind his desk and picked up his phone and began making calls because that was how he handled problems. He identified them, he removed them, he replaced them, and he moved on. That was the system that had built his empire. That was the system that had made him one of the most powerful men in Chicago. Identify, remove, replace, move on. He did not think about Anthony Russo's face against the metal counter. He was very practiced at not thinking about things he didn't want to think about. He did not think about the aprons folded and left behind. I thought about the agency. He thought about replacements. He thought about the event in 3 weeks that he needed full staffing for. He thought about Gerald Ashford, who had been gracious enough about the incomplete dinner, or at least had smiled graciously enough, which was the same thing in Vincent's world. He thought about his empire. He did not think about what it was built on. By midnight, he had spoken to 4 different staffing agencies. All 4 had been polite. All 4 had promised to do what they could. One had expressed concern about the timeline. Vincent had expressed in return the financial incentive he was prepared to offer, and the concern had evaporated. I went home at 1 in the morning feeling the way he usually felt after a difficult night, tired but certain. Certain that by morning the problem would be addressed. Certain that the system would continue to function because it always had. Certain that people were replaceable, situations were manageable, and fear properly applied was the most reliable tool of governance that had ever existed. He was wrong about all 3. By 6 in the morning, he had received calls from 7 managers across his various properties. The 2 restaurants, the private club, the hotel, and the 2 specialty retail operations that fed money into the larger structure. The calls had different details and different voices, but the same essential content. Employees had been talking. Word had traveled. People across the entire organization had heard what happened to Anthony Russo, and the response was not what Vincent Romano had anticipated. His hotel was running on skeleton staff. His club had 3 employees show up instead of 22. His second restaurant had sent him a message through a manager who sounded genuinely frightened. The morning crew had arrived, learned what had happened the night before, and 12 of 14 people had turned around and walked back out. Vincent sat with his phone in his hand and felt something that was unfamiliar to him. Not quite fear, more like the vertigo that comes when you step onto something you believed was solid and it moves beneath your foot. The particular disorientation of discovering that what you built your weight on is not what you thought it was. He called his head of operations, a man named Carl, who had been with him for 15 years and who was in Vincent's assessment entirely unshockable. Carl answered on the first ring. He was already at the main office. "How bad is it?" Vincent said. Carl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Vincent, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen your organization handle things that would have broken most companies. But I need you to understand something right now so that we can address it correctly." Another pause. "This is different." "Different how?" Different because it isn't about money. I've already had people call me this morning who said they'd take a pay cut to go somewhere else. That's not normal. That's not a negotiation. That's something else. What is it? It's what happens, Carl said slowly, when people decide they have been afraid for long enough. Vincent was quiet. I need you to come in, Carl said, and I need you to come in ready to hear something you probably don't want to hear. Vincent came in. He sat across from Carl in the conference room at the main office, and Carl laid out the situation in precise and careful language. The numbers, the absences, the calls, the coverage gaps, the events that were coming up and the staff that didn't exist to handle them. Vincent listened without interrupting, which was not something he typically did, but Carl's tone was unusual enough that it created a kind of stillness in the room. When Carl finished, Vincent said, "Who do we have? In terms of loyal people who will stay regardless?" Yes, Carl thought about it. 40%, maybe, and that's being generous. The other 60, gone or going or waiting to see. Waiting to see what? Carl looked at him steadily. Waiting to see what you do next. Vincent stood up and walked to the window. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did, moving relentless, unconcerned with the internal crisis of any individual man, no matter how powerful. He watched it for a moment and felt the vertigo again. I'll hire replacements, he said. You won't find enough, not with the reputation you have right now. Word travels, Vincent, especially in this industry. I've already had 3 calls from the people at competing restaurants asking if we're having a staffing crisis. Tell them we're not. They already know we are. Vincent turned from the window. There was something in his face that Carl had not seen in a very long time, not since the early days when they were both younger, and the empire was still being built and everything was uncertain. It was the look of a man who was beginning to understand that his plan might not work. Then what do you suggest? Vincent said. Carl didn't answer immediately. He was saved from having to by a knock on the conference room door. His assistant, Julia, opened it without waiting and said, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a woman here who says she has an appointment. I don't have an appointment, Vincent said. She says she made it this morning. Julia, I was up at 5. I know, but Julia paused. She's already been here for an hour, Mr. Romano. She says she'll wait as long as it takes. Vincent looked at Carl. Carl shrugged slightly, a small gesture that meant I don't know either, but this might be worth seeing. Send her in, Vincent said. And that was how Maya Carter walked into Vincent Romano's world for the first time. She came through the door without hesitation. Not the hesitation of someone trying to appear confident, but the actual ease of someone who had walked into difficult rooms so many times that the difficulty had stopped registering as something remarkable. She was wearing a well-cut blazer over a printed blouse, and she carried a leather portfolio under one arm, and she was a plus-size woman with natural hair and earrings that caught the light. And she looked at Vincent Romano the way almost no one ever looked at him. She looked at him like he was a problem she had seen before. Not like he was powerful. Not like he was dangerous. Not like he was the man whose name made people lower their voices in restaurants across Chicago. She looked at him the way a doctor looks at a patient, with attention, with assessment, and with the particular calm of someone who already has a diagnosis. Mr. Romano, she said. Her voice was steady and warm. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who had spent years learning how to be heard without needing to be loud. My name is Maya Carter. I'm a corporate conflict mediator from New York, and I specialize in organizational collapse. I don't recall requesting a mediator, Vincent said. You didn't. Carl did, 3 hours ago. She glanced at Carl, who had the expression of a man who was not entirely surprised to find himself caught out. He reached out to my firm at 5:47 this morning, which suggests that he understood the severity of what's happening here before you did. Vincent looked at Carl. Carl met his gaze without flinching. You could have told me, Vincent said. I'm telling you now, Carl said, by bringing her here. Vincent turned back to Maya. He studied her for a moment with the careful attention of a man who had spent decades reading people looking for weakness, calculating leverage, determining in the first 30 seconds of any encounter where the other person's vulnerabilities were and how to use them. He found nothing to use. That was unusual enough to be interesting. Sit down, he said. She did. She set her portfolio on the table and opened it, and she began speaking with the efficient precision of someone who doesn't waste time on preamble because she understood that the people in rooms like this were more dangerous when they had time to rebuild their defenses. You lost approximately 60% of your workforce across 6 properties in the last 12 hours, she said. Not because of a labor dispute, not because of a competitor, because of what you did to one man in one kitchen. That's an extraordinary chain reaction, and it tells me something very specific about your organization, which is that your people are not afraid of you anymore. She let that settle for a moment. Or more precisely, they were afraid of you for so long that when they finally stopped being afraid, they stopped all at once, like a dam. She looked at him directly. That's the most dangerous moment in any organization built on fear, because it doesn't give you time to adapt. Vincent was quiet. I've seen this happen before, Maya continued. Different industries, different people, same architecture. You build something impressive, and you build it by making sure that everyone around you understands what the consequences of failure are. And for a long time that works. People perform, numbers go up, the empire expands. She paused. But what you don't see while all of that is happening is what it costs, not in money, in something you can't put on a balance sheet. And what is that? The part of people that believes tomorrow will be better than today. She said it simply without drama, the way someone states a fact they have had to explain many times to many people who didn't want to hear it. When people work under fear long enough, they stop believing in better. And when they stop believing in better, they stop being afraid of worse. And when they're not afraid of worse anymore, they leave, Carl said quietly. They leave? Maya agreed. She looked at Vincent. You hit a man in front of 23 witnesses. A man who had given you 22 years and was working his 16th consecutive hour when he made a mistake. And those 23 people looked at what you did and made a calculation. She closed her portfolio. They decided that anything, any uncertainty, any hardship, any risk of unemployment was preferable to staying in a place where that could happen to them. The room was very still. Vincent said, "And you're here to do what? Exactly, tell me to apologize." "No," Maya said. "I'm here to offer you something harder than an apology." She reached into her portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "I'm here to offer you the chance to find out who you actually are underneath what you've spent 20 years becoming." She placed the paper on the table in front of him. It was, as far as Vincent could tell, a proposal, a structured plan, a timeline. He picked it up and read through it, and as he read, his expression went through several changes. Skepticism, confusion, something that might have been the beginning of anger, and then a kind of stillness. He set it down. "You want me to work in my own businesses," he said, "as a regular employee, for 7 days, without my title." "Without any of it," she said. "No title, no bodyguards, no deference. You check in as a contract worker. You do whatever job you're assigned. You eat what the staff eats and work the hours the staff works and live inside the reality you've built for the last 20 years. She looked at him steadily. "And at the end of 7 days, you decide what you want to do with what you've learned." Vincent looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "And if I refuse?" Maya picked up her portfolio and stood. "Then I leave and you spend the next 6 months trying to find, hire, train, and retain enough replacement workers to keep your properties operational while your competitors observe your difficulties and your clients begin to wonder whether your instability is contagious." She walked toward the door, then she stopped. "But I don't think you'll refuse." "And why is that?" She turned back. "Because you're still here listening, and men who only care about power don't listen this long." She left the room. Carl and Vincent sat in silence for a moment. "Where did you find her?" Vincent said finally. "She found me," Carl said. "Her firm monitors organizational crisis signals. She reached out before I even knew I was going to call her." He paused. "That's the second thing that tells me she might be the right person for this." "What's the first?" "She's the only person who's walked into this room today who wasn't afraid of you." Vincent looked at this door she had left through. He looked at the sheet of paper she had left on the table. He looked at Carl, who was watching him with the particular patience of someone who has worked beside another person long enough to know when to speak and when to wait. He picked up the paper again. He read it again. "I thought about the kitchen, about the aprons on the counters, about the sound of 23 people going silent. About Carl saying they were afraid for long enough. He thought about Gerald Ashford's polite smile and the deal that was probably dead already, because men like Gerald Ashford could smell instability the way animals smell fire. I thought about his mother, which he almost never did, because thinking about his mother required him to be someone different from who he had become. And the distance between those two people was not a comfortable place to stand. He set the paper down again. Call her back in, he said. Carl stood. What are you going to tell her? Vincent Romano looked out the window at Chicago, at the city that had given him everything and taken things from him he hadn't known he was giving away, and said, tell her I'll do it. Carl made the call. Maya came back into the room within 3 minutes, which told Vincent something he filed away without commenting on. She had been close enough to hear, or she had expected him to say yes, or both. She sat down across from him again and opened her portfolio, and this time her expression had shifted slightly. Not warmer exactly, more focused. The way someone looks when a project they care about has just become real. 7 days, Vincent said. Starting when? Tomorrow morning, Maya said. 5:45 a.m. You'll report to the loading dock at your hotel on Wacker. The facilities manager there doesn't know who you are. As far as he's concerned, you're a contract laborer named Vincent Caruso, sent by the staffing agency. Caruso, Vincent repeated. Your mother's maiden name, Maya said. I thought it was appropriate. Vincent looked at her sharply. You did research. I do research on every client. She didn't apologize for it. It's how I understand what I'm working with. He wanted to be offended. He found that he wasn't quite, which was itself an unfamiliar sensation. And what are you working with? He said. Maya looked at him for a moment before answering, and he had the uncomfortable feeling of being read. Not the surface reading he was accustomed to performing on other people, but something that went deeper, that looked past the suit and the posture and the controlled expression and found whatever was underneath. Someone who built something real, she said finally, and forgot why he was building it. The room was quiet. Carl poured himself a glass of water and said nothing. There are parameters. Maya continued moving forward in the way she always moved without lingering on moments that had already done their work. You carry no phone that identifies you. You carry no credit cards with your name. You have an emergency contact number, mine, but it's only for genuine emergencies. And Vincent, I need you to understand that nothing about your empire counts as a genuine emergency for the next 7 days. Staff shortages, client calls, financial decisions, none of it. She looked at him steadily. Carl handles the organization while you're gone. Carl has never run the full operation alone, Vincent said. Carl has been running significant portions of your full operation alone for years, Maya said. You just haven't been paying attention. She glanced at Carl. Tell him. Carl set down his water glass. He had the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time for a particular conversation. She's right, he said simply. I've been carrying more than you know, Vincent. Not because you asked me to, because things needed to be done and you were, he paused, choosing the word carefully, elsewhere. Vincent absorbed this. Elsewhere, he said. Focused on the things that felt like control, Carl said. The deals, the meetings, the appearances, the parts of running an empire that feel like running an empire. He paused again. The actual management, the people, the day-to-day, the problems that don't have a dramatic solution. I've been handling most of that for a while. I just never said so because you didn't ask. Another silence. This one had a different quality, heavier. How long? Vincent said. Honestly, Carl thought about it. 3 years, maybe 4. Vincent said nothing. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands on the table, and Maya, watching him, noticed that something moved across his face. Not anger, not exactly. More like the expression of a man who has just learned that a wall he believed he built himself was actually assembled by someone else while he wasn't looking. All right, he said finally. His voice was quieter than it had been. 5:45. Loading dock. Vincent Caruso. Maya nodded once. One more thing. She reached into her portfolio and removed a manila envelope and slid it across the table. This contains a letter. Read it tonight before you go to sleep. Don't read it before then. Vincent looked at the envelope. His name was not on it. No name was on it. It was sealed. What's in it? He said. Something you need to know, she said. But not yet. He picked it up. He felt the slight weight of it, not heavy. A few pages at most. He set it in front of him and looked at Maya Carter, who was closing her portfolio again, with the efficient movements of someone whose work for the moment was done. "You're strange," he said. It wasn't an insult, it was a genuine observation. "I've been told that," she said. "Usually by people who later tell me I was exactly what they needed." She stood. "Get some sleep, Mr. Romano. Tomorrow is going to be a longer day than you expect." She walked out, and this time Vincent didn't watch the door. He looked at the envelope on the table. He looked at Carl. Carl was looking at him with an expression that was, for the first time in their 15-year relationship, something very close to hope. "You think this is going to work?" Vincent said. "I think," Carl said carefully, "that it's the only thing that might." Vincent took the envelope home. He put it on his nightstand. He ate dinner alone, which was how he ate most dinners in the large house that he had bought, because it was the right size for a man of his position, not because he wanted the space. He changed his clothes. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, and somewhere around 10:30 at night, he picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single photograph and 3 handwritten pages. He looked at the photograph first. It was old, the kind of old that puts soft yellow edges on everything and makes the colors look like they belong to a different world. A woman stood in what appeared to be a commercial kitchen, wearing a white apron, her hair tied back caught mid-motion. She was laughing at something off-camera. She looked tired and alive, at the same time the way people look when their work is hard and they love it anyway. It was his mother, Carmela. He hadn't seen this photograph before. He didn't know it existed. He set it down and picked up the handwritten pages. The handwriting was not Maya's, it was older than Maya, more deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write when it mattered more than it does now. It was a letter from Anthony Russo, written not in anger, not as accusation, but in something much harder to receive than either of those things. It was written with love, the exhausted, complicated, grief-mixed love of someone who has known a person for so long that they can remember who that person used to be. Anthony wrote about Carmela. He wrote about the early days before the empire, when Vincent was a young man learning the restaurant business from his mother's kitchen, and Anthony was learning it alongside him. He wrote about how Carmela had treated her workers, every dishwasher, every busboy, every delivery driver, with the same attention she gave to her best customers, because she believed and said so often enough that Anthony had memorized it, that the way you treat the people who work for you tells God more about your character than anything you say in church. He wrote about watching Vincent change, not all at once, gradually. The way seasons change imperceptibly day by day, until one morning you look outside and the world is entirely different from what it was, and you can't point to the exact moment it turned. He wrote about the last several years, about the double shifts, about the injury that people hid because they were afraid of losing their jobs, about the maintenance requests that went unanswered, about the accidents waiting to happen, about the mat by Station 4 that had been reported twice and ignored twice. He wrote about it all without bitterness, which was the thing that made it hardest to read, because bitterness is armor, and this letter had none. At the very end, Anthony had written, "I don't hate you, Vincent. I knew your mother. She would have been proud of everything you built. She would have been heartbroken at what you used to build it." Vincent sat with that letter for a long time. He did not sleep well. At 5:15 the next morning, he was awake. He dressed in clothes he rarely wore, simple work pants, a plain shirt, boots. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized himself, which was the point and which was also unexpectedly a relief. The man in the mirror looked like someone with nothing to prove. He looked like someone who hadn't decided yet what he was going to be. At 5:43, he arrived at the loading dock of his hotel on Walker Drive. The facilities manager was a compact, energetic man named Dennis, who shook Vincent's hand with the professional briskness of someone who has 100 things to do and a schedule that doesn't bend. "Vincent Caruso," he said. "That's right," Vincent said. "Good. We're short 3 people today, so you're stepping into a gap. You'll be rotating some supply management, some logistics support, some general maintenance backup. You comfortable with that?" "Yes," Vincent said. Dennis looked him over with the practiced eye of someone who spends his days evaluating whether the person in front of him is going to be a problem. "You've done facilities work before, some time ago," Vincent said. "All right, stick close to Ramon for the first hour. He'll show you the flow." He pointed at a heavy-set man in his 40s who was already moving supplies on a hand truck, with the efficient unhurry of someone who knows exactly how much energy the day requires and has long since stopped wasting any of it. "Ramon, new guy." Ramon glanced over. "Caruso?" "Yeah." "Come on." He didn't slow down. Vincent followed. The first hour was physical, genuinely unexpectedly physical. Vincent was not unfit, he swam occasionally, and he walked more than most people assumed, but the kind of work Ramon moved through was different from any exercise Vincent had experienced. It was constant, low-grade, relentless. Boxes to the storage room, carts to the service elevator. A piece of equipment that had broken down and needed to be moved around a corner and down a service corridor. A delivery that had come to the wrong entrance and needed to be redirected and then signed for and then moved again. Raymond talked while he worked, not conversationally but practically telling Vincent where things went, how the storage system was organized, which elevators to use and which ones to avoid, because they'd been slow since Tuesday and nobody had come to fix them yet. You put in the request, Vincent said. 3 times, Ramon said. You know how it is. They've got a list. We're somewhere on it. He shrugged with the particular equanimity of someone who has learned not to expect things to move faster than they move. You get used to it. Vincent said nothing. He thought about Carl saying that things didn't get done because he was elsewhere. He thought about the maintenance requests Anthony had mentioned in his letter. He moved the next box where Ramon told him to move it and said nothing. By 8 o'clock, his back was aching in a way he hadn't felt since he was 30. By 9, he had developed a blister on his left heel because the boots he'd chosen were broken in for walking, but not for the particular type of movement that facilities work demanded. He didn't mention it, Ramon wouldn't have had much patience for it, and Vincent understood in a way that was becoming clearer with every hour that was appropriate. At Nini 15, Ramon stopped at a small break room near the service corridor and poured himself a coffee and poured one for Vincent without asking. They sat at a metal table that wobbled slightly on an uneven leg, and Ramon ate half a sandwich he'd brought from home, and Vincent drank the coffee, which was mediocre because it was made in a machine that was at least 10 years old and hadn't been replaced because nobody above Ramon's level had thought to check what equipment the service staff were using, and they sat in silence for a few minutes. Then Ramon said, "First day at this location," Vincent said. "Where were you before?" "Different kind of work," Vincent said. Ramon nodded. He looked at his hands around his coffee cup. They were the hands of someone who had worked with them for a very long time, not rough in a dramatic way, but marked, experienced, honest. "It's not bad here," he said. "Could be better, but it's not bad." "What would make it better?" Vincent said. Ramon looked at him sideways, and for a moment Vincent thought he'd said something wrong. Pushed too hard, asked something that sounded like management rather than coworker. But Ramon just shrugged. "Elevator getting fixed would be nice. The schedule's been rough lately because we lost 2 people last week and nobody's replaced them yet, so we're running double routes most days." And he stopped. "What?" "Doesn't matter," Ramon said. "I'm asking," Vincent said, and something in the way he said it, not like a man gathering information, not like a man who was going to report back, but like a man who actually wanted to know, must have registered, because Ramon looked at him again, and this time the sideways assessment lasted longer. "The break room," Ramon said finally. "The coffee machine's broken. I mean the good one. The one that made decent coffee. It broke 4 months ago and nobody replaced it. Somebody put in a ticket. Nothing happened." He shook his head. "It's a small thing, but after 8 hours on your feet, a small thing can feel big, you know." Vincent looked at the coffee machine in the corner of the room. It was the old one, the mediocre one. He looked at the coffee in his cup. He thought about the fact that he owned this hotel. He thought about the fact that a coffee machine had been broken for 4 months and no one had fixed it, and the people who used this break room had simply absorbed it, added it to the list of small things that were supposed to be addressed and weren't small signals that the people above them were not paying attention. "I didn't say any of that." He said, "Yeah, I know." The day continued. The day was long. At 2 in the afternoon, Vincent was assigned to support a room setup on the 14th floor for a small business conference, moving tables, setting up chairs, arranging equipment. He was working alongside a young woman named Jess who moved with the quick efficiency of someone who has done a job so many times that her body knows the next step before her mind decides it. She was friendly in the way people are friendly when they're busy, warm, but economical, smiling when she looked at him but not stopping. They worked in comfortable silence for a while. Then Jess said, without looking up from the table she was adjusting, "You're new, right?" "Started this morning," Vincent said. "From the agency." "Yeah." She nodded. "We've had a lot of agency people this week. Something happened at one of the other properties. I don't know the whole story, But supposedly there was some kind of incident and a bunch of people walked out. She moved a chair with the ease of habit. Honestly, from what I heard, I don't blame them. Vincent kept his face carefully neutral. What did you hear? Jess glanced at him. She was deciding how much to say to someone she didn't know yet. Then she said, just that the boss, the main guy Romano, did something bad, like really bad, to someone who'd been there forever. She shook her head. I never met him. Most people here haven't. He doesn't really come by this property much. But the stories, she paused. What kind of stories? She looked at him again, that same careful measuring look. The kind of stories that make you glad your actual boss is Dennis, she said simply. Because Dennis is a pain sometimes, but he's never going to, she stopped, made a decision. He's never going to make you feel like you're nothing. Vincent moved the next table without speaking. I thought about that phrase for the rest of the afternoon. Never going to make you feel like you're nothing. He had never in 20 years of running his empire thought about whether his employees felt like something or nothing. He had thought about their performance. He had thought about their compliance. He had thought about their output and their reliability and their cost. But whether they felt like something while they were doing all of it, whether they went home at the end of a day feeling like they mattered or like they were furniture that had never entered the calculation. He understood, working beside Jess on the 14th floor of a hotel he owned, that this was not a minor omission. At 4 o'clock, there was an incident. A guest on the 7th floor, a businessman in an expensive suit who had the agitated energy of someone who had not had a good day, stepped into the service elevator that Vincent and Ramon were using to transport supplies and immediately started complaining. The elevator was slow. The hotel was not performing to his standards. He had been waiting for something from room service for 45 minutes. He wanted to speak to a manager. Ramon listened to all of it with the steady patience of someone who has heard variations of this speech many times. He said calmly and professionally that he would radio the front desk immediately. He said he was sorry for the delay. He made no excuses. The businessman looked at Ramon, then at Vincent, then back at Ramon, and said with the particular contempt that certain people deploy towards service workers like a weapon they have never questioned whether they have the right to carry. Do you people even understand what I'm paying to stay here? Ramon didn't flinch. Yes, sir. I'll make sure your concern reaches the right person. The businessman got off at the next floor, still talking. When the elevator doors closed, Ramon looked at the wall in front of him and said nothing for several seconds. Then he said quietly, Tuesday. He's been here since Tuesday. He pressed the button for the next stop. He does that every day. Does management know? Vincent said. Management knows. A pause. They apologize to him. They comp him things. Another pause. Nobody ever says anything to us. The elevator arrived at its floor. They moved the supplies. They said nothing else about it. But Vincent thought about it. He thought about it while they worked, and he thought about it in the break room at the end of his shift when he drank another cup of mediocre coffee and his back ached and his heel had a blister, and he was more tired than he had been in years. And he thought about what it costs a human being to absorb that kind of treatment day after day without anyone above them ever standing up and saying that is not acceptable. I thought about it on the drive home, sitting in the back of an unremarkable car that Maya had arranged because she had correctly anticipated that his regular driver would be recognized by too many people. I thought about it in the shower and at dinner, and when he sat down at his kitchen table and looked at the manila envelope that he had put there that morning before leaving. He opened it again and read Anthony's letter a second time, and this time certain sentences landed differently than they had the night before because now he had 8 hours of context that he hadn't had yesterday. At 10:30, his phone rang. Maya. How was the first day? She said. Longer than I expected. That's always the first thing people say. There was something in her voice, not quite warmth, not quite amusement. Attention, maybe. The particular quality of someone who is listening carefully. What surprised you most? He thought about Ramon and the coffee machine. He thought about Jess and the phrase, never going to make you feel like nothing. He thought about Ramon in the elevator, absorbing the contempt of a man who would never know he deserved nothing he was receiving. How much people absorb, Vincent said finally, without saying anything, without expecting anyone to notice. Silence on the line. That's an honest answer, Maya said. You expected something else. I expected something defensive, she said, about the physical difficulty or the systems or the inefficiencies. Something that let you stay on the outside of it. A pause. The fact that you went straight to the people says something. Don't compliment me yet, Vincent said. It's day one. I'm not complimenting you, she said. I'm observing. Another pause. Go to sleep. Day two is different. Different how, you'll be in one of your restaurant, she said. The second one, not Romani's. A beat of silence. The people there know Anthony. Some of them were friends with him. She let that sit for a moment. They don't know they'll be working with the man responsible for what happened to him. Vincent was quiet. Good night, Mr. Romano, Maya said and ended the call. He sat at the kitchen table for a while. He picked up Anthony's letter and held it without reading it. He thought about 23 people going silent in a kitchen. He thought about the sound of his own voice saying, clean this up. He thought about his mother's face in that photograph, laughing at something off camera, tired and alive, believing that the way you treat people tells God more about you than anything you say in church. He put the letter down. He went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. The next morning, day two, he arrived at Romano's Trattoria, his second restaurant, smaller than Romani's, tucked into a neighborhood that had changed 3 times in 20 years and somehow always retained a corner for this particular building at 6 in the morning. He was assigned to prep work, chopping, organizing, restocking. The work of the early kitchen hours before the heat and the rush and the noise, when the day was still theoretical and the kitchen was quiet and everyone moved slowly on purpose. The chef running the morning prep was a woman named Gloria, who was somewhere in her mid-50s and who moved through the kitchen with the authority of someone who has earned her relationship with the space through years of showing up. She assigned Vincent his station without ceremony, showed him what needed doing, and went back to her own work. He worked quietly. He listened. And within 30 minutes, he had heard Anthony's name for the first time that morning. One of the prep cooks, a young man named Carlos, mentioned it to another prep cook while they were working side by side, not loudly, not dramatically, but the way people mention things that are still close to the surface and haven't settled yet. You hear anything from Anthony? Carlos said. Nothing since the day it happened, the other cook said. Maria talked to his wife. She said he lowered his voice slightly. She said he's not doing well. His nose, that, and a pause. She said he doesn't want to cook anymore. Like at all. Carlos was quiet for a moment. 22 years, he said. Yeah. They worked in silence. Vincent kept his head down and his hands moving and felt something in his chest that was so unfamiliar, he took a moment to identify it. It was shame. Not the performance of shame, not the social acknowledgement of having done something wrong, but actual shame, the kind that sits in your body and makes everything heavier. The kind that doesn't let you look away. I thought about Anthony not wanting to cook anymore. About a man who had built his life and his identity around the act of feeding people, of transforming ingredients into something that made people close their eyes with pleasure, and who, now because of 4 seconds in a kitchen, could not find his way back to that. He thought about what he had destroyed, not a plate of food, not an evening with a client, but something in a person that had been built over decades and could not simply be rebuilt because Vincent Romano decided it was time to move on. The morning service started at 11. Vincent moved from prep to support work, running supplies between stations, keeping the pass-through clear, doing the 100 small, invisible tasks that keep a kitchen functioning and that nobody with a title ever thinks about. He worked hard. He worked carefully. He did not make mistakes. At 12:30, during the height of the lunch rush, the kitchen had the particular controlled chaos that experienced kitchens carry well. Loud, fast, everyone moving on the understood choreography of people who have worked together long enough to anticipate each other. Vincent was running a supply cart through the back corridor when he heard a voice he recognized. He stopped. Coming through the service door at the back was a woman in her 60s, small and deliberate, wearing a coat even though it was warm, carrying a container that smelled immediately and specifically of something Vincent had not smelled in 20 years. His mother's kitchen, his mother's food. He knew those specific layers of garlic and basil and something deeper underneath without being able to name exactly what it was, only that it belonged to a time before all of this. The woman stopped when she saw him. She had the kind of face that holds its history, honestly, lines around the eyes. That come from years of expression, not neglect. She looked at him with an attention that was immediate and searching, And he realized with a start that moved through him like cold water that she was looking at him the way you look at someone you almost recognize, someone who resembles a person you used to know. "You're new," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Vincent said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "What's your name?" she said. "Vincent," he said. And then catching himself, "Caruso." Something moved across her face, barely perceptible, but it moved. "I'm Rosa," she said. "I used to work here. I still bring things sometimes." She held up the container slightly. "For the staff. Old habit." She looked at him for another moment. "You have people here, Vincent Caruso family in the city." "My mother passed," he said, "some years ago." Rosa nodded slowly. "What was her name?" He told her. He said the name before he thought about whether he should say it because there was something about this woman's manner, the directness of it, the complete absence of performance that made evasion feel wrong. Rosa went very still. Then she looked at him, really looked at him the way she should have been looking from the beginning if she'd had reason to, and her expression did something complicated that he didn't know how to read. She set the container down on the cart beside him very carefully, as if she needed to have her hands free. She looked at his face, his hands, his face again. "I knew Carmela," she said quietly. "I worked beside her for 9 years, before all of this." She gestured, and the gesture somehow encompassed the whole building, the whole empire, everything that had grown from those early years. "You have her eyes," she said. "I should have seen it sooner." Vincent said nothing. "She would have loved what you built," Rosa said. "She would have loved that you took her recipes and made something real out of them." Her voice was even careful. "She was so proud of you, even at the end. She talked about you all the time." His jaw tightened slightly. "But she would have been frightened," Rosa said, and the words came gently and without mercy at the same time, the way the truest things always do, "of the man I've been hearing about, the man who did what he did to Anthony." She paused. "Anthony worked for her first, you know, before you took over the kitchen. She loved him like a son, same as you." Vincent looked at the wall. He was breathing evenly, deliberately, the way he always breathed when something was pushing against the control he kept over himself. "She used to say," Rosa continued quiet and steady, "that the thing that separates a good man from a powerful man is what he does when nobody's watching, when there's nothing to gain, when it's just him and another person and a choice." She picked up the container again. Anthony was watching. 22 other people were watching. She looked at him one final time. What they saw wasn't what she raised. She walked past him toward the kitchen. He stood in the corridor for a long time. His back ached. His heel hurt. The sounds of the kitchen rushed around him. The calling of orders, the clatter of plates, the particular aliveness of a place where people were working hard at something that mattered. He had built all of this. Every piece of it. 20 years starting from nothing, building something that thousands of people depended on every single day. And standing in the back corridor of his own restaurant, wearing clothes that weren't his and a name that wasn't his. Listening to the kitchen he had built run itself without him, he understood something that no rival, no crisis, no financial pressure had ever forced him to understand before. He wasn't losing an empire. He had already lost himself somewhere inside it, quietly, gradually, the way seasons change. And he hadn't noticed because the empire kept growing and growing, felt like proof that everything was fine. It wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for a long time. He picked up the cart. He went back to work. He did not stop for the rest of the shift. He moved and lifted and ran supplies and kept his head down and worked beside people who laughed sometimes and complained sometimes and talked about their families and their plans and their small daily aggravations, and he listened to all of it with the attention of a man who is learning something he should have known decades ago. At the end of the day, when the kitchen was winding down and the last tasks were being completed and people were beginning to move toward the exit, Gloria stopped beside him and looked at his work for a moment. She was not a woman who gave compliments cheaply. She looked at what he had done and said briefly, "Good work today." It was 11 words total. It was the most Vincent Romano had felt like himself in longer than he could remember. Gloria's 11 words followed Vincent home that night. Good work today. That was all. No ceremony, no context, no awareness that she had just said something to the man who signed her paychecks. Just a direct, honest assessment from someone who had no reason to be anything other than direct and honest because she didn't know who she was talking to. And that was the part that stayed with him. Not the compliment itself, but the purity of it. The fact that it was real. The fact that in 20 years of running his empire surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear because telling him anything else carried consequences, he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be evaluated on nothing except what he actually did. He sat with that on the drive back. He sat with Rosa's voice in his head. She would have been frightened of the man I've been hearing about. And he sat with the image of Anthony's wife, telling Maria that Anthony didn't want to cook anymore, and he sat with the weight of all of it, pressing down on him in a way that was new and uncomfortable, and that he did not try to push away, because somewhere in the last 48 hours, he had started to understand that the discomfort was the point. Maya called at 10. Day 2, she said. Tell me. I met Rosa Bennett, he said. A pause. Not surprised. Carefully not surprised, which meant she had known this was likely and had let it happen anyway. How was that? She recognized me, he said. Not immediately, but she figured it out. I know, Maya said. He was quiet for a moment. You knew she'd be there. I knew she brings food for the kitchen staff on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Maya said. I knew she worked with your mother. And I knew, she paused. I knew that the things she would say to you were things you needed to hear from someone who loved your mother, not from me. You arranged it. I created the conditions, she said carefully. What happened in that hallway was real. I can't arrange real. I thought about that distinction. It was a finer line than it appeared. He thought about how deliberately she had constructed the last 2 days, the loading dock, first the anonymous physical labor, the slow accumulation of context, and then Rosa. Not the other way around. If Rosa had appeared on day 1 before his back ached and before he'd sat in a break room with a mediocre coffee and heard Ramon talk about the elevator that nobody fixed, the words would have landed differently. They would have landed on a man who still had his defenses fully operational. 2 days of being nobody had quietly removed those defenses. You're good at this, he said. It wasn't flattery. It was the same kind of honest assessment Gloria had given him. I've had a lot of practice, Maya said. With men who built things, they stopped being able to see clearly. A pause. Get some rest. Day 3 is harder. Harder than today. Today you saw how people live inside your empire, she said. Tomorrow you're going to see what your empire looks like from the outside. From the people who need it and can't access it the way you access it. A beat. That's a different kind of hard. He didn't ask her to explain. He was beginning to understand that she parceled out information with the same precision she applied to everything else, giving him exactly what he needed to receive in exactly the order he needed to receive it. He was also beginning to understand that this precision was not manipulation. It was, in its way, a form of respect. She was treating him like someone capable of handling the truth as long as it was given to him in a sequence that made the truth accessible rather than defensive. Nobody had treated him that way in a long time. He went to sleep earlier than he had in years. He didn't know why. Maybe because for the first time in a long time, he had actually used his body. Maybe because the weight of what he was carrying had become specific enough to be set down temporarily. Whatever the reason, he was asleep by 10:30, and he slept without dreaming. And when the alarm went off at 5, he felt something that he eventually identified with some surprise as rested. Day 3 began at 6:15 in the morning at a community services office in the Southside neighborhood where 40 years ago, a younger Vincent Romano had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment with his mother and his grandmother, and the particular quality of life that comes from loving each other in a small space. He had not been back to this neighborhood in over 15 years. Maya had arranged for him to spend the morning volunteering at a food distribution program that operated out of a community center 2 blocks from where he had grown up. She had not explained in advance why this particular location. She hadn't needed to. The program coordinator was a woman named Diane who spoke fast and moved faster and had the organized urgency of someone running an operation that perpetually had more need than resources. She handed Vincent a volunteer shirt and a position at the distribution table without stopping her own motion. We're expecting 400 people today, she said. Maybe more. It's end of month. Is that typical? Vincent said. Every month, she said. End of month, beginning of month. When the checks run out and the next ones haven't come. She looked at him briefly. You've done this before. No, he said honestly. All right, it's simple. People come to the table. You hand them what's on the list for their household size. You smile. You don't make them feel judged. That's the entire job. She was already moving. The smiling part is more important than you'd think. He worked the table. People came through in a line that started outside the door and moved slowly, steadily, with the particular patience of people who have learned not to expect things to move quickly. Families, single parents with children on their hips, elderly men and women who moved carefully and accepted their distributions with the quiet dignity of people who have maintained their pride through circumstances that had no interest in accommodating it. Young people who couldn't quite make eye contact, and older people who made direct eye contact and said thank you with a completeness that meant something different than polite acknowledgement. Vincent handed out food and looked at faces and smiled, because Diane had said the smiling was more important than he'd think, and she had been right about everything else so far. At 8:45, an older man named Joseph got in line. He was maybe 70, with the build of someone who had worked physically his whole life and carried the record of it in his posture. He wore a clean shirt and pressed pants. He had a veteran's pin on his collar. He moved through the line with careful unhurry, and when he reached Vincent's station, he looked at the items on the table and then looked at Vincent, and Vincent recognized something in his face that he had seen the day before on Ramon in the service elevator after the businessman said, "Do you people even understand?" The thing he recognized was the practiced art of not showing what you actually felt. "Good morning," Vincent said. "Morning," Joseph said. He had a voice like gravel and good wood, low and solid. "Family size?" Vincent asked. "Just myself." A pause. "My wife passed last year." Vincent looked at him. "I'm sorry," he said. Not the automatic sorry that fills social space. The actual kind. Joseph seemed to notice the difference because he looked at Vincent more carefully for a moment. "You're new here," Joseph said. "Yes." "I've been coming here for 2 years," Joseph said. He said it without shame and without self-pity, as a plain fact about his life. "Before that I had enough, then I had less, then I had this." He took the items that Vincent placed in front of him and put them carefully in his bag. "It's good what they do here," he said. "It helps." "I'm glad it helps," Vincent said. Joseph looked at him one more time. "You're going to be good at this," he said. "You look at people like they're people." He moved on down the line. Vincent stood at his station and thought about 22 years of looking at Anthony Russo and seeing an employee. He thought about Ramon and Jess and Carlos and Gloria and the hundreds of people who had moved through his properties for 2 decades, and he thought about whether he had ever once looked at any of them the way Joseph meant. As people. Not as functions, not as outputs, as actual human beings with wives who passed and children at home and bad days and things that sustained them and things that diminished them. I was still thinking about it when Diane appeared beside him during a brief lull and handed him a water bottle and said in the tone of someone who has been observing him all morning, "Where are you from?" "South Side," he said originally. She looked at him. "I thought so. You've got that look." "What look?" "The look of someone who left and came back and is seeing it for the first time." She drank from her own water bottle. "We get volunteers like that sometimes. People who grew up around here and did well and then come back to give time. Most of them think they're going to feel good about themselves." She was quiet for a moment. "Most of them feel something more complicated than that." "Yeah," Vincent said. "That's not a bad thing," Diane said. "Complicated is honest." She moved back toward the center of the operation. He worked until noon. When the distribution wound down and the volunteers began cleaning up, Diane found him again and said, with the same directness she brought to everything, "Will you come back?" I thought about the 7 days. He thought about what came after the 7 days. He thought about Maya's question, "At the end of 7 days, you decide what you want to do with what you've learned." "Yes," he said. He meant it. On the drive to his afternoon placement, which Maya had scheduled at his private club, the most expensive of his properties, the one with the highest paying clientele and the most elaborate service requirements, Vincent called Carl. He did it quickly before he could think about whether it was within the parameters Maya had set, because there was something he needed to know, and it couldn't wait. "The community food program on Ashland," he said when Carl answered. "Southside. I want to know what connection, if any, our foundation has to them." Carl was quiet for a moment. "I'll look into it. I want to know by tonight." Vincent Maya said, "I'm not asking about the business," he said. "I'm asking about our charitable foundation. The one that exists specifically to support community programs." A pause. The one I haven't looked at closely in 3 years. Carl was quiet again with a different quality this time. I'll have the information by tonight, he said. Thank you. He ended the call. He arrived at the club at 1:30. His cover here was busing support and service assistance, the invisible tier of labor that makes a luxury experience feel effortless to the people paying for it. His supervisor for the afternoon was a young man named Thomas, 24 years old, 3 years at the club, who had the nervous precision of someone trying very hard to do his job exactly right because he understood exactly what was at stake if he didn't. Thomas ran his small team with anxious efficiency, always slightly ahead of the next task, always monitoring the room with the particular alertness of someone who knew that the people sitting at those tables had the power to complain in ways that had lasting consequences for people like Thomas and nobody at all for people like themselves. The afternoon service was a private luncheon for a group of 12 businessmen. Vincent worked the room at Thomas's direction, clearing, replacing, anticipating. He was good at reading people, always had been, and the skill translated here to anticipating what a table needed before they noticed the need. Water glasses, bread, the subtle signal of someone turning to look for a server. He was refilling water at the far end of the table when he heard his own name. He kept his face completely neutral. His hand kept moving, the water glass refilled. Romano's having some kind of internal crisis, said a man at the table's middle, mid-50s. The kind of tan that comes from places that cost money to access. Staffing collapse across 3 properties. Heard from someone at Greenfield Partners that Ashford walked away from the deal. Not surprised, said another man across from him. Romano's always been volatile. Sooner or later it catches up. The restaurant is still good, offered a third. The restaurant is empty half the time right now, the first man said. You can't run a kitchen on 6 people, and you can't rebuild staff in this industry when the word is out about how he treats people. He picked up his water glass, the one Vincent had just refilled, without looking at the hand that had filled it. He broke someone's nose, for God's sake, in front of the whole kitchen. That's Romano, though, the second man said. You knew what you were getting into if you worked for him. Everyone knew. Sure, but knowing and enduring are different things. Apparently his people finally decided they were done enduring. Vincent moved away from the table. He went back to the service station and stood there for a moment and breathed. Thomas appeared beside him with the quiet urgency he applied to everything. You all right? Fine, Vincent said. Side of the table 12 needs another bread basket. Thomas moved. Vincent followed because movement was the right thing and because standing still gave the thoughts too much room. I knew what you were getting into. Everyone knew. The words sat in him like stones. Not because they were cruel, they weren't even meant for him, but because they were casual. The assessment of his character had been reduced to something that people said over expensive lunches, without lowering their voices, without any particular feeling, as a plain observable fact about the world. Romano's volatile. Everyone knew. I thought about what it meant that his volatility had become a known quantity, predictable, factored in. The men at that table hadn't said it with outrage. They'd said it with the bored familiarity of people discussing weather patterns. That was somehow worse than outrage. Outrage meant someone still expected better. Familiarity meant the expectation had already died. The afternoon moved. At 3:30, an incident occurred in the service corridor that snapped Vincent's attention back with the sharpness of cold water on a sleeping face. He heard it before he saw it, raised voices. One controlled and one not, coming from around the corner near the linen storage. He came around the corner and saw Thomas backed against the wall, and a man he recognized, one of the regular members, a real estate developer named Pierce, who had been a client of Vincent's in a different context, someone Vincent had cultivated and accommodated because his business was useful, standing very close to Thomas with the physical language of someone deliberately using his size. I asked for something very simple, Pierce was saying. His voice was at the volume people use when they want to be frightening without being overheard. I asked 3 times, and every time I get some excuse about staffing or, Mr. Pierce, I understand and I apologize, Thomas said. He was keeping his voice professional with visible effort. We're working with reduced capacity today, and I don't care about your capacity. I care about my request. Sir, I will personally make sure. Don't tell me what you'll personally make sure. You've been personally making sure for 40 minutes and nothing has happened. Pierce leaned slightly forward. Do you understand that I pay more per year to be a member here than you make in 3 years? Thomas said nothing. There was nothing to say. He absorbed it the way Ramon had absorbed it in the elevator. The way everyone in Vincent's world absorbed it, because that was the implicit deal. We make you feel like nothing, and you say yes, sir, and apologize for existing in the same space. Vincent stepped around the corner. I didn't rush. He walked at his normal pace, which was unhurried and direct, and he came to stand beside Thomas and looked at Pierce. Pierce looked back at him with the irritation of someone who has been interrupted and doesn't yet recognize by whom. Is there a problem? Vincent said. Pierce looked him over. A worker, a nobody, someone without a title or a suit who had no business inserting himself into this situation. Nothing that concerns you, Pierce said. I disagree, Vincent said quietly. Pierce blinked. Excuse me. This man has been doing his job professionally, and you've been speaking to him in a way that is not acceptable, Vincent said. He kept his voice even, controlled, quiet in the way that Vincent Romano's voice was always quiet, and Pierce, who knew that sound, in another context suddenly looked at him more carefully. Who are you? Pierce said. Someone who works here, Vincent said, and someone who's going to make sure that your request is addressed in the next 10 minutes. He looked at Thomas. Thomas, get Mr. Pierce what he needs. Thomas moved immediately, clearly grateful for any motion that changed the situation. Pierce stood in the corridor looking at Vincent with an expression that had shifted from irritation to something more uncertain. There was something in this man's stillness, in the particular quality of his calm, that Pierce couldn't place but that his instincts were reacting to. You're very confident for a service worker, Pierce said. Yes, Vincent said simply. He didn't explain. He didn't justify. He held Pierce's gaze until Pierce, somewhat to his own visible surprise, looked away first. Pierce straightened his jacket. Fine, he said, and walked back toward the dining room. Vincent stood alone in the corridor for a moment. He breathed. He thought about Thomas's face, the relief, and under the relief, something else. Something that was still damaged by what had just happened, even though it was over. I thought about Thomas going home tonight, and his wife or his roommate, or his mother asking how his day was, and whether Thomas would mention this moment or absorb it into the long accumulation of moments he carried without talking about. I thought about how many Thomas situations had happened in his properties over 20 years in corridors and service elevators and break rooms and everywhere else that members and guests interacted with his staff, and how many of those situations had been addressed and how many had been absorbed because nobody above a certain level was paying attention. He already knew the answer. At 5 o'clock, when his shift ended, Thomas found him at the exit. Thomas looked at him with the direct evaluation of someone who has decided to say something and is deciding how. You didn't have to do that, Thomas said, with Pierce. I know, Vincent said. People here, Thomas paused. Members get a lot of latitude. The management expectation is that we absorb it. I know, Vincent said again. Thomas looked at him for a moment. Why did you step in? Vincent thought about all the answers that were true. He thought about Anthony and the metal counter. He thought about Ramon saying nobody ever says anything to us. He thought about Joseph at the distribution table, dressed with care and saying it helps. He thought about Gloria's 11 words and Rosa's comparison to his mother and the businessmen saying Romano's volatile everyone knew. Because someone should have been doing it for a long time, he said, and nobody was. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, thank you. Vincent nodded and walked out. Behind him, he heard Thomas exhale a long, slow breath, the kind that comes when someone has been holding themselves together for hours and has finally found a moment where they don't have to. Carl called at 6. Vincent was in the back of the car, headed to wherever Maya's parameters allowed him to go, which was his house, he was beginning to realize also the place where the most fundamental questions of the last several days were waiting for him. The foundation, Carl said without preamble. Carmela Romano Community Fund, established 15 years ago, annual budget allocation of $400,000. And Vincent said, he could hear in Carl's tone that there was an and. It hasn't been actively managed for 3 years, Carl said. The money is still going out, but the program director position has been vacant since Sandra retired and nobody replaced her, which means the grants are being administered by accounting on a maintenance basis, same programs, same amounts. No new evaluation, no new relationships. A pause. The community food program on Ashland applied for an increased grant 8 months ago. The application is still sitting in a queue. Vincent closed his eyes for a moment. How much did they apply for, he said. $15,000, Carl said, for new equipment and expanded capacity. Another pause. They currently serve 400 people per distribution day. With the increase, they estimated they could serve 600. $15,000. In the context of Vincent's operation, $15,000 was nothing. It was less than he had spent on table settings at Romani's 2 years ago. It was less than the cost of one private event at the club. It was the amount of money that applied to that program would feed 200 additional people every distribution day. It had been sitting in a queue for 8 months because nobody was paying attention. Fix it, Vincent said. Maya said, I'm not talking about the business, he said. I'm talking about my mother's foundation. The one with her name on it. Get the application out of the queue, process it, and get someone on the program director position before the end of the month. His voice was steady and quiet and completely certain. That's not a business decision. That's a family one. Carl was quiet. Then, yes, I'll handle it. Thank you. He ended the call. He sat in the moving car and felt the city moving around him and thought about 400 people in a line that started outside the door and moved with the patience of people who had learned not to expect things to move quickly. He thought about Joseph and his veteran's pin and his press pants and his wife who had passed in the 2 years he had been coming to that program. He thought about his mother's name on a fund that had been sitting dormant because the man whose empire it was had been elsewhere. Always elsewhere. Maya met him at his house at 7:30. This surprised him. Their previous conversations had been by phone. She arrived without advance notice, and he answered the door himself because he had no staff at the house, another thing he had stopped noticing until the last several days had made him notice everything. She came in and sat at the kitchen table, and he made coffee, real coffee from his own machine, which was a very good machine because he had at some point in the last 20 years decided that personal comfort was something he was entitled to in ways that the people who worked for him were not. And she accepted the cup and looked at him across the table with the same careful assessment she had brought to the conference room 3 days ago. You called Carl, she said. About the foundation, he said, not the business. She considered this, then nodded once. Tell me about today, he told her. He told her about Joseph at the distribution table and Thomas in the corridor and Pierce and the businessmen at lunch, saying Romano's volatile everyone knew. He told her in a different way than he had told her things before, less structured, less controlled. He told her the way someone tells things when they've stopped arranging the telling to reflect well on themselves. She listened without interrupting. She drank her coffee. When he stopped talking, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, How many properties do you own? 6 operational, he said, 2 in development. And in 20 years, how many times did you personally spend 8 hours doing the work your staff does? He looked at her. Before this week, never. Right. She turned her coffee cup slowly on the table. That's not unusual. Most owners at your level don't. But most owners at your level also haven't built their operation on the specific architecture you built yours on, which is fear as the primary management tool, she said directly, not harshly, just directly. When you use fear as a management tool, you create an environment where problems don't surface. People don't tell you about the elevator that needs fixing, or the coffee machine that's been broken for 4 months, or the application that's been sitting in a queue for 8 months. They absorb those things because surfacing problems to you has historically had consequences. She looked at him. Which means you've been running an empire almost entirely blind. The picture you had of your own operation was the picture people were afraid not to give you. Vincent sat with it. It was not comfortable. It was also unmistakably true. How do you fix that, he said. You already started, she said, by being in the building, by working beside the people, by seeing the corridor incident and responding to it. She paused. But awareness isn't enough. You can be aware and still be what you were last week. She looked at him carefully. The question isn't whether you understand what was wrong. The question is whether you're willing to do the thing that's harder than understanding, which is change the system, she said, not adjust it, not modify the edges, change the fundamental item. She set down her coffee cup, which means dismantling the thing that made you feel safe. Fear, he said. Control, she said. Fear is just one version of it. The deeper thing is the belief that if you control enough variables, nothing can hurt you. Nothing can fail. Nobody can leave. She looked at him with that direct assessing gaze. That belief is what broke Anthony's nose. The sentence landed like a physical thing. He didn't say anything for a moment. "I need to see him," he said. "Anthony, yes." Maya looked at him. "Why?" "Because I need to say something to him that isn't an instruction or a transaction," he said. He was working this out as he said it, feeling the truth of it as it came. "Because in 22 years, I never once asked him how he was doing, and he knew my mother, and he didn't want to cook anymore because of what I did, and—" He stopped. His jaw was tight. "Because it's the right thing." Maya was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different. Still careful, but different. "Not yet," she said. "You have 4 more days. You need to be in the work for all of them. If you go to Anthony now before you've finished, it's still about your need to feel better." She held his gaze. "You go to him when you have something real to offer, not just an apology, real change, something he can see." Another pause. "Can you wait?" It was the hardest question she had asked him. Not because he didn't know the answer, because the answer was yes, and yes meant staying in this discomfort for 4 more days without the relief of action. It meant sitting with what he had done without being able to resolve it yet. It meant being accountable in the hardest way, not through grand gestures, but through patience, through the daily discipline of working beside people and seeing them and choosing differently, even when no one who mattered was watching. He looked at his coffee cup. He thought about Anthony's letter. He thought about Carmela laughing in that old photograph. He thought about Rosa saying it wasn't what she raised. He thought about Thomas's long exhale in the service corridor. "Yes," he said, "I can wait." Maya stood. She picked up her portfolio. She moved toward the door with the same unhurried certainty she brought to all her movements, and then she stopped and turned back. "Vincent," she said. He looked up. "Your mother would be proud of this," she said. "Not of the empire, not of the wealth. She didn't specify, and she didn't need to. This," she said again. "What's happening in you right now?" She walked out. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time after that. The house was quiet around him, the large, expensive, empty house that he had bought because it was appropriate for a man of his position. He sat in it and felt its size differently than he had before. Not as a symbol of what he'd achieved, as a fact about how alone he had made himself. Tomorrow was day 4. He didn't know yet what Maya had planned. He had stopped trying to anticipate her because every time he thought he understood the sequence, she introduced something that proved he was still only seeing part of the picture. That was its own lesson, though he hadn't named it yet. The lesson that a man who had spent 20 years believing he could anticipate and control everything was discovering the particular humility of being led somewhere he couldn't see. He washed the coffee cups. He turned off the kitchen light. He climbed the stairs to the bedroom where Anthony's letter still sat on the nightstand, and he looked at it for a moment before getting into bed. He didn't pick it up. He didn't need to read it again. He had it memorized now, every sentence of it, the way you memorize something that changes the shape of your thinking permanently. I thought about the last thing Anthony had written. "I don't hate you, Vincent. She would have been proud of everything you built. She would have been heartbroken at what you used to build it." He lay in the dark and thought about what you used to build something, about the choices that become materials, about the fact that you can construct something magnificent and not notice until someone holds up a mirror that you have been building with the wrong materials for years. I thought about Thomas. He thought about Joseph. He thought about the 600 people who could be fed if $15,000 moved out of a queue. He closed his eyes. Day 4 was coming. And for the first time in 20 years, Vincent Romano fell asleep not thinking about his empire. He fell asleep thinking about his people, about who they actually were, about what they actually needed, about what it would mean, what it would actually concretely, structurally mean to be a leader worth following rather than a man worth fearing. The difference between those two things had always seemed to him like a matter of philosophy, abstract, theoretical, the kind of distinction that people made in books and conference rooms. But that didn't survive contact with the real world. He understood now that he had it exactly backwards. The fear was the thing that hadn't survived contact with the real world. It was the trust, the slow, daily, unglamorous earned trust that was real. That was what held things together when everything else fell apart. That was what made Ramon still show up every morning despite the broken elevators. That was what made Gloria give honest assessments to people she just met. That was what had made 23 people stay silent in a kitchen, not out of fear, but out of something they had decided together without words was more important than their jobs. He had built an empire. He had almost missed the point of it entirely. Day 4 started with a phone call that Vincent almost didn't answer. It came at 5:12 in the morning, 13 minutes before his alarm, from a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, which was what he would have done a week ago. An unrecognized number at 5 in the morning was either a mistake or a problem someone else should be handling. But something had shifted in him over the last 3 days, some fine internal calibration that made him reach for the phone instead of away from it. Mr. Caruso. The voice was young, uncertain, carrying the particular strain of someone who has been awake too long. This is Patrick, from Romani's. Thomas gave me this number. He said if anything happened with the setup for the Meridian event, I should call you. Vincent sat up. What happened? The florist we contracted for the Meridian dinner, the whole centerpiece delivery, they called an hour ago. The driver had an accident on the expressway. Nobody's hurt, but the truck is on the shoulder somewhere near Oak Park, and the flowers are not going to make it. A breath. The event is at 7 tonight. Mr. Romano, the real. Mr. Romano, he's been trying to reach Carl, but Carl isn't answering yet, and I didn't know what else to do. Vincent was already out of bed. How many tables? 24. And the rest of the event setup? Done. Everything else is done. It's just the centerpieces. But they were specific. The client approved them personally, a specialty arrangement. We can't just replace them with anything. What's the client's name? Meridian Holdings. The contact is a woman named Sandra Cho. Patrick lowered his voice as if he were sharing classified information. She's very particular. Vincent thought fast. He thought about the Meridian event, which he knew about from a distance, a corporate dinner for 40 senior executives. The kind of event that his properties handled several times a year. He thought about the florist contract, which he had never reviewed personally because he had never reviewed vendor contracts personally because he had staff for that. He thought about 24 tables without centerpieces and a particular client who had approved specific arrangements. Get me the florist's name and their backup vendor contact, he said, and send me Sandra Cho's direct number. I can try, but I don't think... Patrick, Vincent's voice was steady, I'm going to help you fix this, but I need those contacts in the next 5 minutes. A pause. Yes, sir. The voice sounded different now, not relieved exactly because the problem hadn't been solved yet, but more anchored, like someone who had been falling and found a handhold. The contacts came through in 4 minutes. Vincent made 3 calls in rapid succession, and then he called Maya. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was already awake, which meant she had anticipated something today, requiring early alertness, which no longer surprised him at all. I need to handle something, he said. It's not about my position. It's about the Meridian event in a florist situation and 23 people who are going to spend tonight scrambling unless I do something right now. A pause. Is it a management decision or a logistics fix? I thought about that distinction. Logistics, he said. I know a florist in Lincoln Park who does corporate work. I've had a relationship with them for 12 years. I can get this fixed in the next hour. Another pause, longer this time. Can you fix it without revealing who you are? I'll make the call as Vincent Caruso, staff coordinator for the event. I'll take care of the arrangement details and then hand off to Patrick. Do it, Maya said, and then proceed with the day as planned. A beat. This is actually useful, Vincent. You'll understand why later. He made the call. The florist, a meticulous woman named Hannah, who had known him for 12 years and who in those 12 years had never once received a personal call from him at 5:30 in the morning, and who therefore answered with significant alarm, heard him out, and said yes before he'd finished the sentence. Because in 12 years, Vincent Romano's operation had been a reliable client, and because Hannah understood with the instincts of someone who has built her own business exactly what it meant when a regular client called at 5:30 in the morning. 24 tables, Hannah said. Corporate dinner, 7 o'clock. Yes. What was the original arrangement? He described it from memory. He had seen the approved design in a planning document 3 weeks ago and had noted it the way he noted everything automatically without intention. White orchids, eucalyptus accent, greenery, no tall arrangements because the tables needed to allow conversation across them. Elegant without ostentation, Exactly the kind of detail that Sandra Cho had spent time specifying. I can do it, Hannah said. I'll need until 3 o'clock, and I'll need 4 of my people working all morning. Whatever you need, he said. Invoice the event directly, and Hannah, thank you. A brief silence on the line. In 12 years, she said, you've never said that to me. He didn't answer immediately. I know, he said. I should have. He called Patrick back with the resolution. Patrick's relief came through the phone like something physical, an exhale that had been held since 5 in the morning. It's handled, Vincent said. Confirm with Hannah's team at 9 to verify delivery timing. Coordinate directly with her. You can do this. Yes, Patrick said. Yes, I can. He sounded surprised that he'd said it that way. Surprised by his own certainty. I know you can, Vincent said, and he meant it. He had spoken to Patrick twice, but he had learned over the last 3 days that people usually could do more than anyone expected of them when someone above them said, I know you can, and actually meant it. He arrived at day 4's placement at 7:15. Maya had placed him in his hotel's event coordination department for the day, working under a senior coordinator named Lillian, who ran event logistics with the serene authority of someone who has seen everything go wrong at least once and has long since stopped being frightened by it. Lillian was 58 years old with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a scheduling system that she had developed herself over 2 decades and that she trusted more than any software anyone had tried to introduce. She assigned Vincent to shadowing the coordination of 3 simultaneous events happening that day: a corporate luncheon, a private anniversary dinner, and in the evening, the Meridian event that he had already intervened in from a distance that morning. He spent the morning moving between teams, taking direction, doing the unglamorous connective work of event coordination, confirming vendor arrivals, communicating between kitchen and front of house, managing the particular kind of crisis that every event produces, small or large, that requires someone to make a decision quickly and move on. I was good at it. He had always been good at the operational side of things. The difference was that now he was doing it without anyone deferring to him, without anyone softening the edges of the reality he was operating in. He was doing it as one person among many who were all trying to make 3 difficult things happen simultaneously. And the equality of that, the fact that his contribution was weighed the same as everyone else's, felt nothing like he would have expected it to feel. It felt honest. It felt in a way he couldn't quite articulate yet, like dignity. At 11:45, the corporate luncheon hit its first serious problem. The audio system in the main event room had developed a feedback issue, a high-pitched interference that was intermittent and therefore harder to diagnose and fix than a clean failure would have been. The technician who handled the hotel's AV systems was already committed to a setup on the 4th floor, and the luncheon was starting at noon. And Lillian came to Vincent with the specific economy of motion that indicated she was managing 4 things at once and needed this one handled without extensive explanation. AV room is in the basement, she said. Rack labeled C7. The backup mixer is on the shelf above it. Thomas knows how to run a backup configuration. He's done it before. Thomas is upstairs, Vincent said. I know, you're going to have to get him on the phone and talk him through it while he's in the room. She was already turning. You've got 11 minutes. He got Thomas on the phone. Thomas was by this point a person he had genuine regard for, the kind of regard that develops when you've seen someone maintain their integrity under pressure and then watch them take a breath afterward and keep going. Thomas was at the luncheon room already watching the feedback spike on the system with the focused unease of someone who knows a problem is present and doesn't yet know if he can fix it. Thomas, Vincent said, backup mixer, C7 in the basement. I've only run the backup once, Thomas said. That means you've run it, Vincent said. Walk me through what you're looking at right now. Thomas described the board. Vincent asked questions. The questions were specific because Vincent had spent enough years overseeing properties that he had absorbed a baseline understanding of every major system in every building he owned, even if he'd never operated them himself. Together over the phone with Vincent asking and Thomas describing and Vincent talking him through the configuration, they built a solution in 8 minutes. At 11:58, the feedback dropped out. The room went clean. From the luncheon room, Vincent heard Thomas let out a breath. Got it, Thomas said. Good work, Vincent said and hung up and stood in the basement corridor next to the rack labeled C7 and felt something that was exactly precisely what Gloria had made him feel with 11 words 2 days ago. the satisfaction of a problem solved by people working together without title or hierarchy, just competence and trust and the willingness to stay on the line. He went back upstairs. At 1:30, during a brief gap between crises, Lillian found him in the coordination office and sat across from him with the cup of tea she apparently required at 1:30, regardless of what the afternoon held. And she looked at him with the kind of attention she probably didn't even know she was giving. "You've done event work before," she said. It was not quite a question. "Adjacent to it," he said carefully. "Adjacent." She considered that. "You know what you're doing, but you're not performing knowing what you're doing, which is the thing most people who come in here with experience do." She sipped her tea. "Where are you from originally?" He had answered this question several times in the last 4 days and had given the same honest answer each time. "Southside," he said. "I left a long time ago." "And came back?" "In a manner of speaking." Lillian looked at him over her teacup. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Yes." "Why do you look like someone who's seeing things for the first time?" she said, "when you clearly have enough experience to have seen most of this before." I thought about how to answer that. He thought about the whole long answer, the conference room, the 7 days, the blister on his heel, Rosa in the corridor, Joseph and his veteran's pin, Anthony's letter on the nightstand. He thought about the short answer, which was the true one. "Because I stopped looking," he said, "for a long time, and now I'm looking again." Lillian nodded slowly. She didn't push further. She was the kind of person who knew when an answer was complete. "That happens," she said simply, "the looking away." She set down her tea. "The trick is to look back before it costs you something you can't get back." He thought about Anthony not wanting to cook anymore. "Sometimes," he said, "you look back after." She looked at him. "Then you do the work from there," she said. "That's all there is. You find out where you are, and you do the work from there." The afternoon accelerated. 3 events running in parallel created a particular kind of beautiful, controlled chaos. The kind that Lillian managed with the fluency of someone conducting a familiar piece of music, knowing when to anticipate and when to respond, knowing which players needed direction and which needed space. Vincent worked inside it and felt something he had almost forgotten was possible in his professional life, the experience of being fully present, not managing from altitude, not overseeing through reports and summaries, inside the work with the people doing it close enough to feel when something shifted. At 4:15, the Meridian florist delivery arrived. Hannah's 4 people brought in the arrangements with the efficiency of a team that had spent the morning working against a deadline, and the results were objectively exactly right. White orchids eucalyptus, the particular low profile that allowed conversation across tables. Patrick supervised the room setup with an authority that he had not had at 5:12 in the morning, and that he clearly didn't quite recognize in himself yet. Vincent watched from across the room. He watched Patrick direct the placement of each arrangement, correct one table where the proportion was slightly off, speak to Hannah's team with respect and specificity. He watched a 24-year-old who had called him at 5 in the morning, uncertain and frightened, do his job with the quiet competence of someone who had been trusted and therefore trusted himself. That was what he had stolen from people Vincent understood. Not just their comfort or their safety, their ability to trust themselves. When you govern through fear, when every interaction carried the potential for consequences, people stopped trusting their own instincts. They stopped taking initiative. They asked permission for things that didn't require permission and deferred decisions that they were entirely capable of making. They made themselves small to fit inside the space that fear allocated. Remove the fear and they expanded back to their actual size. He had been watching it happen all week. At 5:45, Carl called. Vincent stepped into a quiet corridor. "The Meridian client is here," Carl said. "Sandra Cho. She arrived early for a walkthrough." A pause. "She saw the centerpieces. And she called me directly," Carl said. "She wanted to know who handled the florist situation this morning. She had heard about the truck accident. She wanted to know who solved it." Vincent was quiet. "I told her a coordinator named Caruso handled it," Carl said. She said. He paused, and Vincent could hear in the pause that something unexpected was coming. "She said she's been a client for 4 years, and this is the first time she's felt like someone in this organization actually cared about her event more than their own convenience." Another pause. "She wants to meet whoever Caruso is." Vincent exhaled slowly. "Tell her Caruso sends his regards and is occupied with the evening setup. She'll be disappointed." "She'll be fine," Vincent said. The event will be excellent. That's what she actually wants. A beat. Carl, the Meridian account. How important is it? It's one of our top 10 corporate clients, Carl said. Annually, they've been growing their events with us for 3 consecutive years. And 4 years ago, when they started, who handled the onboarding? Carl was quiet for a moment. I'd have to check. It wasn't me, Vincent said. It wasn't a question. No, Carl said. It was the events team. Specifically, it was Lillian. He was standing 20 feet from Lillian's office. He looked down the corridor. He thought about 4 years of a growing client relationship built and maintained and expanded by a woman who had a scheduling system. She developed herself over 2 decades in reading glasses on a chain, and the kind of competence that quietly holds everything together while the person at the top believes he is the reason things work. Carl, he said, yes. I want a full accounting, he said. Every client relationship we have. I want to know who actually built it, who maintains it, who is the real reason they come back. His voice was steady and deliberate. Not the name on the contract, the person who does the work. Carl was silent for long enough that Vincent checked to make sure the call was still connected. Then Carl said quietly and with some feeling, that is going to be a very different list than the one you think you know. I know, Vincent said. That's why I need it. He went back to work. The Meridian event that evening was what Lillian's events always were, executed with a precision that felt effortless because the effort had been comprehensive and invisible. Sandra Cho, whom Vincent observed from a careful distance at the start of the evening, moved through the room with the satisfaction of someone whose specific requirements had been met in ways she hadn't needed to negotiate. She touched one of the orchid arrangements briefly as she passed a table, the way you touch something that's exactly right. Vincent was pulling a cart through the service corridor at 8:15 when he nearly walked into Maya. She was standing just inside the service entrance in professional clothes, carrying her portfolio, looking at him with an expression that he had learned to read over the last 4 days. The one that said something important was about to happen, and she had chosen this particular moment for it deliberately. You're here, he said. I have a meeting with Carl at 9, she said. I came early. She looked at him, at the uniform, the cart, the tiredness that 8 days of real work had put into his body. How are you tired, he said, and more awake than I've been in years. At the same time, she smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile, a real one, not the professional warmth she used as a tool, but something genuine and brief that changed her face for a moment before she contained it. That's what it feels like, she said, when things start moving in the right direction. He left the cart and stood there with her in the corridor for a moment. How long have you been doing this, he said, this specific kind of work? 14 years, she said. How many people like me? She thought about it. Like you specifically. She tilted her head. Maybe a dozen. People who built real things and lost themselves inside them. People who used fear because someone taught them that fear was strength. She paused. People who still had something worth reaching. What makes you decide someone has something worth reaching? She looked at him directly. Whether they can still hear the truth, she said. Some people, by the time I see them, the fear they created has curved back around and become who they are. There's no gap left between the performance and the person. She held his gaze. You had a gap. Small, but it was there. How could you tell? Carl, she said simply. A man who has given up completely doesn't keep someone like Carl. He doesn't tolerate someone who knows the truth and stays anyway. She paused. Carl has stayed because he believes in what you could be. That belief doesn't exist in a vacuum. It means you showed him something at some point that earned it. Vincent thought about Carl, 15 years, absorbing more than Vincent knew, staying anyway. I've taken him for granted, he said. Yes, she said without softening it. You have. She shifted her portfolio under her arm. You should tell him. I will. Not as an instruction, she said. Not as a management decision. Just as a person talking to another person who matters to him. She moved past him. 9 o'clock with Carl. Don't work too late. He watched her go. Then he picked up his cart and went back to work, and he spent the rest of the evening shift carrying and clearing and moving through the hotel and with the unhurried attention of someone who has finally started to understand the shape of the world he actually lives in, not the one he built in his own mind. The Meridian event ended at 10:30. The last guest left satisfied. Sandra Cho said goodnight to Lillian with the specific warmth of someone who felt taken care of and knew it. The team broke down the setup with the efficient tiredness of people who have worked a long day well. At 11:15, when most of the team had left, Vincent found Lillian in the coordination office doing what she apparently always did at the end of an event, a systematic review of the evening's timeline, noting what had worked and what needed adjustment. She didn't look up when he came in. She finished her note. Then she looked up. "Good day," she said. "You worked well." "Thank you," he said. "Lillian," he stopped. She waited. She was patient with pauses. "The Meridian account," he said. "Carl told me you built it 4 years ago." Something moved across her face, a flicker of surprise quickly contained. "Carl told you that?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't build it," she said. "Sandra Cho built it. She needed someone who actually listened to what she was asking for." She set down her pen. "I just made sure she got that." "For 4 years," he said. "That's the job." "Lillian," he paused again. "The person whose name is on this organization, he didn't know your name 3 weeks ago." He said it plainly as the fact it was. He should have known it. He should have known it a long time ago. She looked at him steadily. "You're unusual," she said, "for a contract worker." He didn't answer that. "Did you know," she said slowly, "that there was talk a few years ago about a restructure, the event coordination department? There were going to be cuts." She said it without bitterness, recounting history. "We saved it. The whole team, we put together a cost-benefit analysis, presented it, made the case. Management agreed to keep the department intact." She paused. "Mr. Romano never knew it happened. Carl handled it." She looked at him. "I'm not telling you that because I'm angry. I'm telling you because I think whoever told you about the Meridian account should also know that." He sat down across from her. "Tell me more," he said. "What else should I know?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Are you sure you want to hear this? It's going to take a while." "I have time," he said. She talked for 45 minutes. She talked about the restructure. She talked about the vendor relationships that the team had maintained through periods when payment processing had been slow and vendors had been frustrated and could easily have walked. She talked about a client safety incident 3 years ago that had been handled quietly and professionally without any legal exposure because the events team had written crisis protocols that nobody above them had requested, but that everyone in the department followed. She talked about turnover, which had been high in other departments and low in events, because Lillian had a policy about how people were spoken to in her department that she enforced without exception, regardless of the source. "What's the policy?" Vincent said. "That nobody who works under me is talked to the way I've heard people talked to in other parts of this building," she said simply. "If a vendor does it, I don't renew the contract. If a client does it, I have a conversation." She paused. "I've lost 2 vendor relationships because of it. Both of them came back 6 months later because the events we run are worth coming back for." Another pause. "I've never lost a client over it. Not once." He looked at her. "You run your department with a different set of rules than the rest of the organization." "I run my department the way my mother taught me to treat people," she said, which is apparently a radical concept in some contexts. She said it without sarcasm, as a plain observation. I thought about his mother. He thought about how many Lillians he had in how many departments quietly building something better than the model at the top, protecting their people with the authority they had in the space they could reach. He thought about how much of what worked in his empire was working because of people like Lillian operating by values that directly contradicted the values at the top, carving out pockets of dignity in an organization designed around fear. I thought about what it would mean if the whole organization ran the way Lillian's department ran. He thought about what kind of place that would be. He thought about whether it was possible, whether it was too late, whether the years of the other model had done damage that couldn't be undone, whether Anthony would ever set foot in a kitchen again, and whether that was something that could be changed or something that was simply the permanent cost of who Vincent Romano had been. He thought about Maya saying, "You find out where you are and you do the work from there." "Lillian," he said, "if you had the ability to change one thing, one structural thing, not a small adjustment, but something fundamental about how this organization works, what would it be?" She looked at him. The question had surprised her, not offended her, surprised her. The particular surprise of someone who has had ideas for a long time and has not been asked for them. "The way problems move up," she said after a moment. "Right now, problems move up when there are already crises, because people are afraid to surface them early." If problems moved up when they were still small, if it was safe to say this is going wrong before it's a disaster. She paused. You'd have half the crises you currently have, and the ones you did have would be manageable instead of catastrophic. She said it cleanly and without drama. The way someone states a solution they've known for years to a problem they've been watching compound. He thought about the mat by Station 4, reported twice, ignored, still there when Anthony's foot caught it. The last link in a chain of small problems that nobody had been safe enough to escalate. Thank you, he said. He meant it at a depth that he didn't know how to express in the moment. She looked at him. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been in a professional environment long enough to recognize the difference between performative gratitude and something real. She took her time with it. You're welcome, she said finally, and then with a directness that seemed to be native to people who had actually built things with their hands and their attention. Who are you? He met her eyes. Someone who's been getting an education, he said. She nodded once slowly. Well, she said, you're a good student. He walked out of the hotel at 11:45 into the particular temperature of a Chicago night that has started to move toward autumn when the air still holds summer's warmth, but something underneath it has changed. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the building. His building. 12 stories of glass and steel and the labor of hundreds of people who had spent years making it work and never once been asked the question he had asked Lillian tonight. His phone buzzed. A message from Carl timestamped 11:40 meeting with Maya went long. She wants to see you tomorrow morning. Before your placement. 8 a.m., the office. He texted back, I'll be there. Then he stood on the sidewalk a moment longer. 3 days left of Maya's 7. 3 more days of being Vincent Caruso contract worker. Nobody of consequence, a man with blistered heels and an aching back and a kind of clarity he hadn't possessed in 2 decades. He thought about what came after the 7 days, about the meeting with Anthony that Maya had asked him to wait for, about the list Carl was compiling, the real list, every client relationship traced back to the actual person who built it, about the application sitting in the queue for 8 months and the 600 people it would reach if it moved. I thought about the empire he had built and all the ways it was better than he knew not because of him, but despite him because of Lillian's and Carl's and Gloria's and Thomas's who had held standards inside their own reach when the standards at the top had stopped holding. He thought about what it would mean to deserve an organization like that. I thought about whether it was possible to become that man. Not gradually, not in theory, actually, in practice. In the daily texture of how he spoke to people and what he asked and whether he listened to the answers and what happened when he was angry. And whether the fear of that particular silence that fell over rooms when he walked in, whether that could change. Whether the people who had absorbed it for years could unlearn it. Whether even if he changed completely, the echo of who he'd been would outlast the change. I didn't know. He started walking toward the car. His phone screen lit again, a number he recognized, this time one he had not called in weeks. He stopped walking. It was Anthony Russo's number. Not a call, a text, timestamped 11:51. He opened it. It read, Harriet, you fixed the Meridian Florist situation this morning. Patrick called me. He didn't know who he was calling. He just wanted to tell me something good happened today. He said someone named Caruso helped him when he was scared and didn't know what to do. He said it felt like having a real manager for the first time. A pause in the message. Then I don't know who Caruso is, but I wanted someone to know that it mattered. Vincent stood on the sidewalk and read that text 3 times. Patrick had called Anthony, not because he knew the connection, because he needed to tell someone something good, and Anthony was the person he thought of. Because Anthony, for 22 years, had been the person in that kitchen who people called when they needed to tell someone something. That was what Vincent had broken. Not just a nose, not just an evening. He had broken the person who held that kitchen together by being someone people trusted. He had broken the center point of a web of relationships that had been built over 2 decades of Anthony showing up and being reliable and caring about the people around him. He stood there for a long time. Then he typed back from Vincent Caruso's number, Thank you for telling me. Patrick is going to be fine. He already is. He put the phone in his pocket. He got in the car. He sat in the back as it moved through the city, through the streets of Chicago that had made him and that he had remade himself inside of. And he felt the full weight of what the last 4 days had given him and what they had cost and what was still ahead. 4 days left, 4 days of being nobody, and then the work of becoming someone different from who he had been. Not for the empire, not for the deals or the reputation or the name that people lowered their voices around in restaurants across the city. For the Patrick who called someone when something good happened and needed to share it. For the Thomas who exhaled after someone finally stood beside him. For the Ramon who came to work every morning despite the broken elevator because he was the kind of person who came to work regardless. For the Joseph with his veteran's pin and his pressed pants. For the 400 people in a line that moved with the patience of people who had learned not to expect things to move quickly. For his mother, who had believed that the way you treated people told God more about your character than anything you said in church. He had a lot of telling left to do. The 8 o'clock meeting with Maya started before 8 o'clock. Vincent arrived at the office at 7:42, which meant he was already there when Carl arrived at 7:50, and Carl stopped in the doorway of the conference room and looked at him with an expression that said more than Carl typically allowed his expressions to say. Vincent was sitting at the table with 2 cups of coffee, real coffee from the machine in the executive kitchen upstairs. The good one and a yellow legal pad with handwriting on it, and Carl looked at all of that and then sat down and accepted the coffee without a word. "I got your text last night," Carl said. "I know. You want to do the full accounting. Every client relationship." "Yes." Carl wrapped both hands around the cup. "Vincent, some of what I'm going to show you, it's going to be uncomfortable." "I know that too." Carl looked at him, then he nodded once the way he nodded when a decision had been made that he agreed with and didn't need to argue about. "All right." Maya arrived at 8:02. She came in without ceremony, sat across from both of them, looked at the legal pad and the 2 coffee cups, and the particular quality of the silence in the room and said, "You talked last night before I got here." "Anthony texted me," Vincent said. He slid the phone across the table. She read the message. She read it again. She set the phone down and looked at him with the careful attention of someone who is assessing not just what happened, but what it means. "He didn't know it was you." "No." "But Patrick called him." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "How did that feel?" It was the kind of question Vincent Romano would have dismissed a week ago. Would have called soft, unnecessary, the kind of question that people asked when they wanted to talk about feelings instead of solutions. He answered it directly. "Like understanding for the first time the size of what I broke," he said, "and the size of what was still there despite it." Maya set her portfolio on the table. She looked at Carl. Carl looked at her. Something passed between them. Not words, just the compressed acknowledgement of 2 people who have been separately managing the same situation and have just confirmed without needing to say so that it's moving the way they hoped. 3 more days, Maya said. She looked at Vincent. "And then there's a conversation we need to have about what comes next. Not today, at the end of the 7 days. She paused. "But there's something I need to tell you now before day 5. He waited. "Anthony knows," she said. The room went very still. "He's known since day 3, she continued. "Rosa called him the evening after she saw you in the corridor at the trattoria. She didn't tell me she was going to do it. She did it because she's known Anthony for 30 years and she believed he had the right to know." Maya held his gaze steadily. "He knows you've been working in your own properties as a regular employee. He knows about the 7 days. Vincent said nothing. "He hasn't told anyone else," Maya said. "He called me after Rosa called him. He took some time before he spoke." She paused. "Then he said, tell him to finish it. Don't let him come to me until he finishes it." The weight of that moved through Vincent slowly like temperature change. Anthony knew. Anthony had known for 4 days. And his response, not anger, not exposure, not the reasonable satisfaction of watching the man who hurt him be humbled, had been to tell him to finish, to hold the space for the full 7 days, to insist on the completion of something that had nothing to do with Anthony's own need for resolution and everything to do with what he believed Vincent was still capable of becoming. "He's protecting the process," Carl said quietly. "Even now." "Yes," Maya said. Vincent looked at the legal pad in front of him. His own handwriting, the notes he had been making since midnight, the list of things he needed to change, the structural things. Lillian had identified the management principles that had to be rebuilt from the ground up, the specific people who needed to be seen and acknowledged and given real authority commensurate with the real work they had been doing. He looked at all of it and thought about Anthony sitting with this knowledge for 4 days and choosing to protect the thing that was trying to grow from it. What kind of man does that? Vincent said. He wasn't asking either of them. He was asking himself, Carl answered anyway. The kind your mother would have called a good person, he said. The kind she tried to raise you to be. Vincent picked up his coffee. He set it down. He picked up his pen. Let's work, he said. They worked until 9:30. Maya outlined the post-7 days framework, what she called the rebuild architecture. Not a list of policy changes, not a set of new rules, a fundamental rethinking of how information moved through the organization, how decisions got made, how accountability operated, and most critically, how the people at the working level of the operation were connected to the people at the top. She used language that was specific and operational, not theoretical, because she understood that Vincent Romano did not respond to theory. He responded to structure, to process, to things that had a shape he could hold. At 9:45, Carl produced the accounting Vincent had requested, the real list, printed, organized by property. Every significant client relationship with the actual name of the person inside the organization who had built and maintained it. Vincent read through it in silence. Carl and Maya waited. It took 12 minutes to read. When he finished, he set it down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "How many of these people have I personally thanked? In 20 years, in any form?" Carl said, "I counted on the way over. 11 out of 63. 11 out of 63. The number sat in the room like something with mass. "We're going to fix that," Vincent said. "All 63, not a memo, not a bonus. Personally." He looked at Carl. "I want meetings with each of them. I want to know what they need, what's been in their way, what they would change if they had the authority." He paused. "And then I want to give them the authority." Carl wrote it down. He wrote it down without comment, which was how Carl registered that something was exactly right. Day 5 was at the private club, working alongside the membership services team. Day 6 was back at the hotel in the engineering department, where Vincent spent 8 hours learning how many maintenance requests were in the queue and how long they had been there and what it would take to clear them. Not someday, but actually clear them with a timeline and accountability, and someone whose job it specifically was to make sure that floor mats were replaced and coffee machines were fixed and elevators ran the way they were supposed to run. The man who ran engineering was named Hector, and he had a list. He had been keeping it for 3 years. He had submitted it through 4 different management channels and received in return partial responses and good intentions and nothing structural. Vincent sat with Hector for 2 hours on the afternoon of day 6 and went through the list line by line, and by the end of it, he had authorized repairs on every single item, and Hector sat across from him with the expression of a man who has been waiting so long for something to happen that when it finally does, the relief is complicated by a kind of grief for all the time that passed while he was waiting. "Why did it take this long?" Hector said. He said it carefully, not as an accusation, but as a genuine question from someone trying to understand a system. Vincent told him the truth, because the person responsible for making sure it happened was not paying attention to the right things, he said. And because the system made it hard for people like you to be heard. He paused. "We're going to change the system." Hector looked at him. "You keep saying we," he said, "like you have some authority here." Vincent held his gaze. "I have some authority here," he said. Hector studied him for a long moment, long enough that Vincent felt the familiar tension of a moment that could go several ways. Then Hector said slowly, "You're him, aren't you?" It was not a question. Vincent said nothing. Hector looked at the table. He looked at his list. The 3-year list, the 4 management channels, the partial responses and good intentions. He looked at Vincent. "Are you going to do what you said, the whole list?" "Yes." "Not because I'm watching, not because it looks good, because it needs to be done." "Yes," Vincent said, "because it needs to be done." Hector was quiet for a long time, long enough that the weight of it became something you could feel. And then he said, "I want to be in the room when you tell the team." "You will be," Vincent said. "I'll need you there. They'll need to hear it from someone they already trust." Something moved across Hector's face, something that had to travel a long way to get there, through 3 years of submitted lists and partial responses and absorbed disappointment. He said, "All right." Day 7 arrived with the quiet authority of something that has been earned. Maya had arranged it to end where it began, at Romani's the flagship, the kitchen where 23 people had gone silent, and the empire had cracked down the middle. Vincent arrived at 6 in the morning, not as Vincent Caruso, but as himself in his own clothes without disguise or cover. He had told Maya the night before that he didn't want to cover for the last day. She had said simply, "Good." The kitchen staff on the morning shift arrived between 6 and 6:30. Most of them were the people who had returned in the weeks since the walkout, some of the original 31 who had reconsidered, and some new hires who had come on during the period of managed chaos that Carl had navigated. They came in and found Vincent Romano standing in their kitchen, not at the door, not at the management position, but at a prep station in an apron with his hands already working. The first person through the door was Marco, the line cook who had put a hand on Anthony's shoulder that night, who had asked, "Can you stand?" who had stayed when 23 others left and had been doing the work of 3 people for weeks since. Marco stopped when he saw him. He stood very still. Vincent looked at him. "Good morning, Marco," he said. Marco said nothing for a moment. Then, "Mr. Romano." "I'm on prep this morning," Vincent said. "Tell me what you need." Marco looked at him for what felt like a long time, but was probably 10 seconds. Then he moved to his station. He began his setup. After a moment, he said without looking over, "The tomatoes need breaking down. Station 2. Vincent moved to Station 2 and broke down tomatoes. The rest of the morning shift arrived and found the same thing Marco had found, and each of them had their own version of the 10-second stillness, their own private recalibration of what they were seeing and what it meant. Some of them said nothing. Some said good morning back. One young woman named Petra, who had only been at Romani's for 6 weeks and therefore had less accumulated history with Vincent, Romano said with the cheerful directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid, "Are you any good at this?" "Decent," Vincent said. "We'll see," she said, and went to her station. He worked through the morning prep. He did it correctly and without complaint, and by 9 o'clock the kitchen had reached the particular working rhythm that good kitchens reach when everyone is competent and the tasks are clear and the coordination is working, and he was part of that rhythm rather than above it. He was one person in a system that functioned because all of its parts functioned. He felt that. He felt what it meant to be a functional part of something, rather than the singular point that everything was supposed to orbit around. At 10:15, during a brief lull before the lunch service, Maya arrived. She came into the kitchen with the same unhurried certainty she had brought to the conference room on the first day 7 days ago. She looked at the kitchen, at the prepared stations, the organized pass through the team, moving with the competence of people who knew their jobs, and then she looked at Vincent. "Come with me," she said. He took off his apron. He followed her out of the kitchen and through the restaurant to a small office near the back where Carl was already waiting and where a third person was sitting with his back partly to the door, and Vincent knew before the person turned who it was because he had spent 7 days learning to recognize things he had spent 20 years not seeing. Anthony Russo turned when they came in. He looked different than he had the last time Vincent had seen him, which was the night everything happened, which was the last time Vincent wanted to remember looking at him. He looked older, or maybe just more settled into his age, the way people look when they've been through something that removed the performance of younger energy. His nose was healed, but there was something in the way he held his face that would always carry the memory of it. He stood when Vincent came in, and the 2 men looked at each other across a small room that felt much larger than it was. Vincent had rehearsed nothing. Maya had told him not to when he'd mentioned it. She had said, "If you know what you're going to say, you're not talking to Anthony. You're performing for Anthony." So he hadn't rehearsed. He stood in the room with the man he had hurt and said the first true thing that came. "I don't know how to fix what I did," he said. "I've spent 7 days learning things that I should have learned 20 years ago, and none of it fixes what I did to you." Anthony was quiet. "I broke something in you," Vincent said. "Patrick called you because you were the person he thought of when something good happened. You built that over 22 years. You built yourself into the person people called, and I damaged that." He paused. "I'm sorry, not because I need you to forgive me, because what I did was wrong and you deserve to hear me say it without conditions attached." Anthony looked at him for a long time. The room was very still. Carl stood near the wall. Maya stood near the door. Neither of them moved. Then Anthony said, "Do you remember when your mother taught me the ragu?" Vincent hadn't expected that. "Yes," he said, because he did. He had been 19 years old watching from the doorway of Carmela's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, while his mother stood beside a 20-something Anthony Russo and showed him with the patience and love of someone who believed cooking was a form of prayer how to build a sauce correctly. "She told me something that day," Anthony said. "She said the difference between a good cook and a great one isn't technique, it's attention. She said great cooks pay attention to what's in front of them, not what they want it to be, what it actually is." He paused. "I thought she was talking about food." Vincent said nothing. "She was talking about people," Anthony said. "She was always talking about people." He looked at Vincent directly. "You stopped paying attention somewhere along the way. You started seeing what you wanted instead of what was there." His voice was even, not angry the way someone speaks when they've had time to process something and have come out on the other side of the anger into something more durable. "I know that. I've known it for a long time. I kept hoping you'd find your way back." "Are you back?" Vincent said. "In the kitchen." Anthony was quiet for a moment. "I made dinner last week," he said, "for my wife. First time since—" He stopped. Started again. "She cried, not because it was sad, because—" He stopped again. Something moved across his face, and this time he let it. "Because it tasted like me again." Vincent felt something break open in him quietly without drama. Not collapse, break open. The way things break open when the pressure that has been holding them sealed finally releases. "I want you back," Vincent said. "Not because I need a chef, because this kitchen was better when you were in it and the people in it were better. And I was too blind to understand for 22 years that the thing I was signing my name to was substantially your work." He paused. "But I'm not asking you to come back to the same place. I'm asking you to come back to a different one that I'm going to spend the rest of my career making worth coming back to." Anthony looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Maya. "Is he telling the truth?" he said, "about the intention?" "Yes," Maya said. "About the difficulty of executing it also, yes." She paused. "He has a long way to go, but he knows where he's going now. That's the part that matters." Anthony looked at Carl. Carl said simply, "He called me from a break room on day 2 and asked about your letter. He read it twice." A pause. "He's been reading people correctly for a week. He just has to do it for the rest of his life." Anthony was quiet for another long moment. Then he said to Vincent, "I'll come back. Not next week. I need some more time." He paused. "But I'll come back." He looked at the room, at the three of them, at the specific convergence of this moment. "Under one condition." "Name it," Vincent said. "The mat by Station 4, Anthony said. "I want to be there when it gets replaced. I want to watch it happen." It was such a specific, practical human request that it took a moment to land fully. Not a grand gesture, not a symbolic action. The mat by Station 4, the small failure of maintenance that had been reported twice and ignored twice, and had been the physical mechanism of everything that followed. Anthony wanted to watch it be replaced. He wanted to see the smallest, most concrete possible evidence that something had actually changed. "Tomorrow morning," Vincent said. 8 o'clock. "I'll be there." "So will I," Anthony said. The meeting ended, the way meetings end when the important thing has already happened, with movement, with the practical logistics of next steps, with people reaching for their phones and coats and the ordinary motions of continuing on. Carl and Maya said what needed to be said, and then it was just Vincent and Anthony in the small office, and Anthony was putting on his jacket, and Vincent said, "She would have liked what you did with the letter." Anthony paused. "She would have liked what you did this week," he said. "She always said you had it in you." He looked at him steadily. "I believed her then. I still do." He walked out. Vincent stood in the office alone for a moment. Then he walked back through the restaurant, through the dining room that had been built on his mother's recipes and Anthony's labor and the daily effort of hundreds of people he had spent 2 decades not seeing clearly. And he went back into the kitchen and put his apron back on, and he went back to Station 2, and he worked the lunch service beside Marco and Petra and the rest of the team, and nobody made a speech about it, and nobody needed to. The weeks that followed moved faster than Vincent expected, because real change, he discovered, had a momentum of its own once it started. It wasn't easy. Nobody who told you the truth about transformation said it was easy, and Maya had never once said that. She had said it was possible. She had said it required daily discipline and the tolerance of discomfort, and the willingness to be corrected by people whose corrections you had previously made dangerous. She had said it would require him to sit in meetings and ask questions and listen to answers that made him uncomfortable and not shut the answers down. All of that was true. He met with all 63 people on Carl's list, not in group sessions, one at a time. He sat across from Lillian and Hector and Ramon and Thomas and Gloria and the dozens of others who had been doing the real work, and he asked them what they needed and what was in their way, and he listened and he took notes, and he came back with responses that were not vague commitments but specific structural changes with timelines and accountability. The maintenance queue was cleared in 3 weeks. The events department got the additional staffing Lillian had been requesting for 2 years. The engineering team got a direct reporting line to Carl that bypassed the 3 management layers that had previously filtered and softened and delayed everything Hector tried to surface. The break room coffee machine was replaced the same week as the station format. Ramon noticed it on a Tuesday morning when he came in for his shift. He stood in front of it for a moment, and then he poured himself a cup and he drank it, and he said nothing to anyone, but he told the story at lunch, and the lunch table told other people. And by the end of the week, the coffee machine had become a kind of shorthand in the hotel, a reference point for the difference between before and after, between the time when small things didn't matter and the time when they did. Small things Vincent was learning were not small. The Carmela Romano Community Fund got its new program director by the end of the month, a sharp, mission-driven woman named Keisha, who had spent 8 years in nonprofit management and who sat down with Vincent in her first week and told him with respectful directness that the fund had been significantly underperforming its potential for 3 years and that she had a plan to change that. He told her to execute it. She did. The Ashland program got its $15,000 in its expanded capacity, and on the first distribution day after the expansion, 612 people came through the doors, which was more than the target because word had traveled. The foundation work mattered to him in a way that surprised him with its consistency. He had expected it to feel like obligation, like correction, like the responsible management of something that bore his mother's name. Instead, it felt like the closest thing to Carmela that he had found in years. He went to the Ashland program on distribution days when he could. He worked the table. He saw Joseph regularly, Joseph with his veteran's pin and his pressed pants, who recognized him on the third visit and said with the equanimity of someone who has seen many things and stopped being surprised by most of them, "You're the one who owns this city." "Part of it," Vincent said. Joseph said. "You should have been doing this longer." "Yes," Vincent said, "I should have." Joseph accepted his distribution and moved on, and Vincent handed the next package to the next person, and the line kept moving. The conversation about Maya happened gradually, the way the real things always happen. Not with a moment of declaration, but with an accumulation of smaller moments that eventually became undeniable. She stayed on as a consultant through the first 8 weeks of the rebuild, which was longer than her standard engagement. And she said when he asked that the situation was more complex than most and required extended oversight, which was professionally accurate and also not entirely the point. He knew it wasn't entirely the point. She knew he knew. At the end of the 8th week, sitting across from her in the conference room where this had all started, he said, "What happens when the engagement ends?" She looked at him with the direct assessment she had brought to every moment of their interaction. "That depends," she said. "On what? On whether you're asking as a client or as something else." He looked at her steadily. "Something else," he said. She was quiet for a moment, not uncertain, processing. There was a difference, and he knew the difference now. "Then the engagement ends," she said, "and we figure out what comes next from there." A pause. "I don't get involved with clients. Former clients are a different category." "When exactly does the engagement end?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Friday." "It's Tuesday," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." He smiled. It was not a performance of a smile or the social deployment of one. It was the kind of smile that happens when something feels right in a way that is connected to everything else that has recently become right, when a single moment carries the weight of the whole shift that preceded it, and you feel both things at once. He had not smiled like that in a very long time. She looked at the smile carefully, the way she looked at everything. Then something happened at the corner of her mouth that she contained almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. Don't, she said, but there was no real resistance in it. Friday, he said. Friday, she confirmed. The last transformation was the one he hadn't planned. It happened 3 months after the 7 days on an ordinary Tuesday evening at Romani's. Vincent was there for dinner, not inspecting, not managing, just eating, which was something he had started doing again because he had rediscovered what it meant to be a customer in his own restaurant rather than the owner surveilling an operation. He was sitting at a table near the back when a new server, a young man named Diego, who had been there 3 weeks, came to take his order and said without recognizing him, "The ragu is incredible tonight. The chef put something different in it. I don't know what it is, but it's better." Vincent looked up. "Which chef?" Diego checked his notepad. "Russo," he said. "Anthony Russo. He came back last month. Everyone in the kitchen says he's the best they've ever worked with." Vincent looked at the menu in his hands for a moment. Then he set it down. "I'll have the ragu," he said. Diego wrote it down and moved on because he had other tables and didn't know he had just told the owner of the restaurant something that was going to sit with him for the rest of his life. Vincent sat with his water glass and the low sound of the restaurant working around him and thought about Carmela showing Anthony the ragu on a Sunday afternoon. Pay attention to what's in front of you, not what you want it to be. And he thought about Anthony saying, "It tasted like me again." And he thought about what it meant that the food tasted like Anthony again, and what that meant about the kitchen, and what the kitchen meant about everything. The ragu arrived. He ate it slowly. He paid attention to every element of it. He had his mother's palate he always had, and he could taste the specific decisions Anthony had made, the way the layers built the patience in it, the care. He could taste a man who had found his way back to the thing he loved and was doing it with the full weight of who he was. When Diego came to check on him, Vincent said, "It's perfect. Please tell the chef." Diego went back to the kitchen. 2 minutes later, Anthony appeared at the pass-through, just briefly, just long enough to look out at the dining room with the particular pride of a chef who has received an honest compliment, scanning for the table. His eyes found Vincent's. They held for a moment. Then Anthony nodded once and went back to his kitchen. That was it. That was the whole moment. No speech, no dramatic reconciliation, no scene that anyone else in the restaurant noticed or would have understood if they had. Just two men who had known each other since before the empire existed, finding their way back to a language they had almost lost. Vincent Romano left Romani's that night at 9:30, walked to his car, and sat for a moment before starting it. He thought about everything the last 3 months had been, about the meetings and the structural changes and the maintenance queue and the coffee machine and the mat by Station 4, which Anthony had watched be replaced and which had never folded up at the corner since. He thought about Lillian and Hector and Ramon and Thomas, in the 63 people on Carl's list, in the 612 on the first expanded distribution day. He thought about Joseph and his veteran's pin. He thought about Maya, who was having dinner with him on Thursday, not Friday anymore, because Friday had become insufficiently soon. I thought about his mother, about a photograph with yellow edges, a woman laughing at something off camera, tired and alive, believing in things. He had spent 20 years building an empire by making people afraid. I was going to spend the rest of his life building something that people stayed in because they chose to, because it was worth choosing. Because when you walked through the door and started your shift, you felt like a person who mattered not to the bottom line, not to the quarterly numbers, but to the man at the top who had finally learned what his mother had always known, that the way you treat people is the only true measure of who you are. Not what you build, not what you earn, not the name people lower their voices around, or the reputation that travels ahead of you into rooms. How you treat people. That was the empire worth keeping, and this time he intended to keep it.